Say, hey everyone. Hi. We're sick. We're not gonna have a stream today because we don't feel good. Oh, we should still have a stream? But who's gonna run it? I don't think Ziggy can run it. You think Ziggy can run it? No, I don't think so. Who's that? It's like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Knock, knock, knock. Who's at the door? It's Miss Debbie.
Hey,
do you think
guys,
Miss Debbie can run our stream for us? I think Miss Debbie can run our stream for us. So Penny is very sick. She has been puking all day and night. And so Mama hasn't slept and Mama's getting a migraine.
What is happening?
You have feedback.
I do. I have.
All right, we're going to have to fix Debbie's mic settings. Go into your settings, go into audio, and check the box that says echo cancellation. But everybody, I just wanted to let you know that Debbie is going to run the stream for me tonight because I am getting a migraine and I have to go lay down. But wow, you can't see my hair. We have for you today, the defense is forensic psychiatrist, and there is quite a few, I guess they're not really sidebars if you can hear them, whatever you call them, conversations with the judges back and forth. And then there was they brought back the investigator guy who put the videos in and allowed the videos in. So I took that out because that seemed like a waste of time. And then there's like 5 hours of video where it's the child in the house, but there isn't really much interaction. It's kind of just the child being in the house, and that's all they wanted to show. And I figured I could say to you, hey, there's a bunch of video of the kid being in the house. So you would know that the kid's in the house. And since we can't see the video and there's not really a lot of audio on it, you probably wouldn't want to spend 5 hours listening to all of that. So I cut that part out. Are you better, Debbie? Can we unmute you? I think you have to unmute your mic.
I think you have to unmute your mic. Oh.
No. Are you playing it on a different device?
No.
I think you have to unmute your mic.
Oh.
No.
I'm hearing
Are you
it
playing it on a different device?
through my headphones.
No.
And then I'm hearing the echo from the computer.
Playing it on a different device.
Through my headphones.
No.
And then I'm hearing the
So-
echo.
Try and mute your computer. Sorry, guys. Technical difficulties. We're working on it. Give us a minute.
Computer.
Sorry, guys. Technical difficulties. We're working on it. Give us a minute.
Computer. We're working on it. Give us a minute.
Okay, so while Debbie works on that, no, you didn't miss anything at all. I have a massive migraine. I'm going to bed. Debbie's going to run the stream for us, but we couldn't really test this live. We went through everything. Everything worked good. Our sound worked good. Everything was fine. But now all of a sudden she's got double. It's playing through the computer and the thing. So I'm going to go talk her through that. And I'm going to hit play.
Okay. Do we need to wait for her?
Be nice to Debbie, guys. Have a wonderful
All right.
evening.
We're still in the defense portion of his case, and I know there was an issue raised last week about. I'm assuming your next witness is going to be the psychiatrist. Is that?
So I have a short witness prior to that, Judge. I have Agent Lowe for about 5 minutes. The psychiatrist is Dr. Rappa. She actually got caught in an accident on Southern and is going to, her ETA is parking at 9:05. So if the court does want to wait for Ms. Coakley, it might be a little easier to just go straight through.
I'm not going to wait. The only thing I wanted to address is my understanding from last week is that there was a motion that the state was making in regard to
There's a
additional
Richardson
opinions.
issue. I advise Ms. Coakley I will not be pursuing that opinion, but I don't want to speak on her behalf, so I'm happy to wait.
All right, so nothing for the court to decide?
I don't believe so, but I don't want to misrepresent what Ms. Coakley would like
Ms.
to do.
Ms. Black, are you prepared to respond? And if she's on her way, I can wait a few minutes. Yeah, why don't you check? It's not the biggest deal in the world. This has gone on a while as it is, so another minute's not going to make any difference. Ms. Coakley, I was just raising with Ms. Murad the state's motion, or at least I thought you indicated you were going to file a motion in regard to additional opinions that the defense was attempting to introduce via Dr. Rappa's testimony. Ms. Murad has indicated that she's not pursuing that anymore, so I just need to confirm that there's nothing for the court to decide in regard to that. Is that accurate? Okay, all right, good enough then. All right, so you want to call your next witness, and then we'll see. All right, and so just for planning purposes, give me a little bit of idea of what we're looking at today. I'm assuming this witness up front, Dr. Rappa, and then do you have any other witnesses besides the possibility of your client testifying this?
The defense has no other witnesses other than the possibility of our client. I do have video evidence that I would like to show.
Okay.
It is lengthy. It's a 14-hour video.
It's been admitted into evidence already, or it's going to be part of it?
I provided it to the state, and I have a copy for them that I'll give them right now. And she may have objections. I don't intend on playing the entire amount, though. So my hope
14 hours?
is that I'm playing all of it.
All right. Do you know how much you do intend to play?
About 3.
Okay, all right.
Take off the
Yeah, I only asked not to infringe at all upon your defense, but only to get an idea as to what we're looking at in terms of logistics.
I watched enough videos, so I am trying to be a little mindful about how I present it. But I
Be same type video that we've seen already?
all
Okay.
ring video from
Okay.
those days.
All right.
So we're gonna take time.
Yeah,
Okay.
if there may be objections, Your Honor. I was provided a list of what they intended to offer about probably 9:30 last night. Earlier, I was provided a list with 3,000 videos that was approximately 50 hours long. I started to go through that, but now it's my understanding that's no longer what they intend. And so I haven't had a chance to look at what they offer. That larger list did have things that the state would object to. So just to let Your Honor know, I haven't had a chance to look at this 14-hour video that they now have indicated they're going to enter.
So I'll address that when and if you raise it. So it sounds to me like, Ms. Murad, a reasonable shot of you resting today? Is that, all right. And are you going to make the decision as to whether your client's going to testify before or after you publish the videos?
I don't have an answer to that, but I suspect we will know a little bit more during the lunch hour.
Whether your client's going to testify before or after you publish the videos? Okay. All right, good enough then.
Thank you,
All right, I think we've addressed all the trial issues that I needed to address this morning. Anything else we need to address before we bring the jurors in? Use the mic, Mr. Sooner than later, we'll probably try to do it during the first break. Not the first break, but when we break for lunch, we'll spend a few minutes on that. Are there some issues on the jury instructions that I'm going to need to work through? You need to have a microphone.
So for the parental defense, it's our position that that the burden of persuasion, that once we present it, just like a self-defense, it is upon the state's burden to unprove it or to disprove, and just like self-defense.
Is there a standard that addresses that? Because I really don't intend to depart from the standard if there's a standard.
Yeah. So the jury instruction actually,
Well, here's what we're going to do. I just wanted to know if there's an issue. I will address it then when I bring up the instructions for consideration. We'll probably do that at the lunch hour and take whatever time is necessary to do it then. But and then just be prepared to tell me if there's a standard instruction at that time, and then I'll hear argument on everything. All right. So, Ms. Murad, are you ready to call your next witness in? All right, you may do so. Let's go ahead and bring the jury out now. All rise. All rise. All right, everyone may be seated. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, welcome back. I hope everyone had a good restful relaxation for the long holiday. I hope it was a long holiday for all of you. It was for the court. So with that being said, we are still in the defense portion of the case at this point. And with that, Ms. Murat, are you ready to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Agent Chris Lowe.
Okay.
Do you swear or affirm that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir.
All right, Ms. Murat, you may begin at your convenience.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Agent Lowe. I know you've been here before, so I don't want to belabor your background, but could you restate your name for the record, please?
Yes, I am Christopher Lowe with Jupiter Police Department.
And in this particular case, you received a Dropbox link of the Ring camera videos from Ring. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I just wanted to clarify a few things for the jury regarding that Ring camera.
Yes.
So it's my understanding that some of the videos from the living room are missing. Is that correct?
I cannot confirm that there's any missing videos.
Okay. We don't have any videos after January 9th of videos from the living room, correct?
Within the folder, I'm going to notate the
Go
folder
ahead.
name. Folder 24738902, which is a depiction of the living room. The files encompass January 5th through January 9th.
Okay. And of course, the jury has seen videos from January 5th all the way to January 28th. So it's fair to say that from January 10th to January 28th, there are no videos from the living room, correct?
As provided by Ring, correct.
Have you had an opportunity to view at least one of those cameras from the Ring camera that was placed in the living room?
Is it fixed now? Is sound normal again? I forgot to mute my phone. I'm sorry.
Room?
Yes,
Okay. So when you look out into that camera, you see the living room in front, correct?
correct.
It's kind of like behind a TV, it seems.
It's in a corner.
Okay. So in front of it is like a sofa, is that fair to say?
Yes,
And then the kitchen is behind it, correct?
yes.
And then sort of off to the right, you see the dining room table.
Okay, I can agree to the sofa, the kitchen.
Okay. And do you recall if you can also see the dining room table from that angle?
I don't recall that portion.
Okay. Is it fair to say that no other Ring camera angle shows you the living room, kitchen, and dining room table other than that one?
Of what I observed, that's correct.
I also want to talk about, because the state played a lengthy video with the epoch time and UTC time, could you explain again to this jury? So my understanding is that the file names provided in that Dropbox are, for the most part, a series of numbers. Is that right?
That's correct.
And those series of numbers are indicative of something called epoch time.
Yes.
And could you explain to the jury again how you get from that file name to the date and time?
All right. So in regards to the Unix epoch time that I had previously spoken about, that number itself is a unit of time starting from January 1st, 1970, and it can be notated in seconds or milliseconds. And you can take that number, place it into just a simple converter online, and it'll produce the UTC time, which you can then convert to the Eastern Standard Time.
Understood. So the video that the jury saw, there was a montage of sort of a number of videos from inside of Ronan's room. Those were in UTC time. What is the difference between UTC time and Eastern time?
So for the time in which we're concerned, being in January, it would be a difference of 5 hours. for Eastern Standard Time.
So if something is, let's say, 4:35 p.m. UTC, what is it in Eastern Time?
It would be 11:30.
So if Ronan's getting into bed at 4:30 UTC time, that's actually 5 hours later. Or I'm sorry, 5 hours earlier.
Earlier, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the Eastern Time is earlier.
Yes.
Okay, understood. So the bed example was not a great one. Prior to this, did I give you an example of a file number in this case to convert into UTC time and Eastern Time?
Yes.
Okay. And was that file number 164-138-414-4000?
Yes, that's correct.
So how do we get from that to the UTC time and then to the Eastern?
So simply placing that number into the converter, as I mentioned, it produced a UTC time of 12:02 and 24 seconds PM. And then you just subtract 5 hours to get to 7:02 and 24 seconds.
Are there also file numbers that are not in epoch time?
Yes.
And those file numbers, I believe, start with like 70505?
Generally, yes, that's correct.
What unit of measurement are they in?
That's unknown to me.
Okay. And are those file numbers also indicative of a time and date?
Are those file numbers? Not that I know of.
Okay. Is there a process by which you can determine the time and date from those file numbers?
Yes.
What is that process?
So, as I previously mentioned, there are 11 subfolders within that return from Ring, okay? Within 6 of those subfolders, there's an individual file in each one. When that file is converted into an Excel format, it produces a timestamp associated with the files that begin in the 705. So a simple conversion into an Excel file provides the timestamps necessary to associate.
Thank you. All the videos that you were provided from Ring in that Dropbox are, for the most part, I know there's some that aren't in 60-second intervals, correct?
For the most part.
And it's fair to say that there's no video of sort of 24-hour monitoring of what's going on in the home. It's just sort of those 60-second spurts that we all have to piece together when there's movement.
Correct.
Do you know why from January 10th to January 28th there are no videos of that living room Ring camera?
I do not.
Okay. And are you just relying on what Ring provided to you?
That's correct.
But it is fair to say that the living room camera prior to that did exist, right?
Correct, from what I received January 5th to the 9th.
And there's no video on the 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th of the Ferriters taking that down that you're aware of?
I did not review that camera in that specificity. I didn't review each of those videos, no.
Understood. Yeah. No further questions for this one.
All right, any cross, Ms. Coakley?
You don't know why there isn't additional videos, right?
Correct.
They could have turned off the camera, right?
There could be a number of reasons, correct.
Then that's one of them, right? They could have turned it off, correct?
Correct.
They could have unplugged it.
That's possible.
Yeah. They could have, it could have just broken, correct?
Yes.
That's all the questions I have.
All right, any redirect?
Since it's movement activated, if they did come in and turn off the camera or take it out, you would suspect to see movement there, right?
Objection as a speculation.
Overruled.
It's possible to capture that video.
Okay. And in this particular case, Ms. Coakley gave you a number of options of it could have been this, it could have been that. It's fair to say you have no idea. You just have what you have from Ring.
Correct.
So you have no ability to say that the Ferriters turned that off, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, they didn't turn off any of the video in their son's own room, right, during that time period. There's no evidence of that.
I cannot determine whether or not a camera is turned off.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Murad. Is this witness now excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, sir, that concludes your testimony, and you're excused from further proceedings in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Murad, I'll call your next witness, please.
Dr. Sheila Rappa.
All right, Ms. Murad, you may begin at your convenience.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you introduce yourself to us, please?
Sure, my name is Sheila Rappa.
Dr. Rappa, what do you do for work?
I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist.
I want to start with your sort of experience. Can you take us through your educational experience to become a clinical and forensic psychologist?
Yes, so I received a bachelor's degree in psychology in the year 1990. I went on to get my master's at Obizu University in 1994, and then I completed my doctorate in 1999, also at Obizu University. I did my internship at Miami Children's Hospital. I did the inpatient and the outpatient unit, and I did my residency at Atlantic Shores Hospital. I was licensed in Florida at the year 2000.
When you talk about some of your sort of work experience, can you take us through specifically the experience that you've had working with children with severe sort of behavioral issues?
Sure. My first introduction to children with severe trauma or severe behavioral issues was right after I got my master's degree. I had to do clinical hours, and I did them at a place called Kids in Distress that is in Fort Lauderdale. At Kids in Distress, it's a not-for-profit, but they take in all types of children, normally children that have been removed from their homes due to severe neglect or any kind of childhood trauma. So Kids in Distress would have any children from birth, all the way up. The ones I worked with were probably up to the age of 13 at that time. So I did that for my clinical hours, and then they hired me, so I started working there, and I worked a lot with children at that facility that were just severely traumatized, had diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder, had diagnoses of PTSD, just different types of childhood disorders. When I did my internship, or when I chose what internship I wanted to do, I really did want to focus on children, and I wanted to focus on victims. So Miami Children's Hospital was available to me, and that's one of the places that I applied to do my internship and was accepted. Miami Children's Hospital at that time had an outpatient unit, and they also had a locked residential unit. So I not only saw the children that were on the outpatient unit and did therapy with family and children, a lot of trauma. Also, there were the children that were on the inpatient unit that were actually locked inside the psychiatric facility because they were a harm to themselves or others. After I finished my internship, I quickly, within probably a year, started working at Chrysalis Health. Chrysalis Health is a community mental health center, serves about 3,000 clients a week, so very busy mental health center. Best known in the community for working with trauma and children and adolescents that are exhibiting behavioral problems, PTSD, any type of diagnosis pretty much that you can imagine. When I started at Chrysalis, I started just doing therapy, doing assessments. And then as I continued to work at Chrysalis, I became the clinical director. And right before I left Chrysalis, within like 3 or 4 years, I was their chief clinical officer. That meant I had to oversee probably 200, maybe 250 therapists that were doing the work in the families, in the homes, with the children, with the traumatized individuals. I also had to do the clinical programming for our group homes. We had residential homes, which were group homes, for adolescents that had kind of failed out of the foster care system. Nobody would take them, so they put them into our group homes. Severe behavioral disturbances, a lot of trauma there. And I oversaw all their clinical work for that. And then pretty much after that, I just continued with my private practice. I started a private practice quickly after I got licensed, and worked at Chrysalis, also did a little bit in my private practice, but eventually the private practice kind of took over, and now I'm in private practice full time, and I only do forensic work. No more clinical work for me.
How long in your career did you do clinical work? So when did you go full time into the forensic?
I did clinical work from 1995, probably until 2010, maybe?
So pretty recent.
Yeah.
That was your consistent practice, was doing clinical work. Is that fair to say?
It was. I really, really love the clinical work. I like being in the gutter kind of with the families and helping them figure things out, and with children. My practice just got too busy and I couldn't do clinical work. I couldn't maintain the consistency anymore.
What experience do you have working with parents of children who have sort of early life trauma and severe behavioral issues?
Most of the parents that I have worked with that if you're going to talk about really significant trauma or really significant abuse, the parents that I would most likely work with would be foster parents or adoptive parents. there's not a whole lot of biological parents that I had to work with where their children were very severely abused or neglected, although there have been some. But most of it is foster care people that get their foster care parents that get these children and don't know what to do, or adoptive parents that get these children and they really just don't know what to do.
Now, your doctorate is a PsyD, so you're a psychologist, correct?
Correct.
This jury heard from the state's expert, Wade.
Okay, I just want to say one thing real quick. Meg told me that this woman has testified for the prosecution in other cases. And I just think that's interesting because that's got to be awkward. Because I don't understand why any registered psychologist would be on the defense for these people. I don't get it.
Myers, who is a psychiatrist. Can you explain to us the difference between psychology and psychiatry?
Sure. So psychiatrists are medical doctors. They actually go to medical school, just like, you know, your PCP would have gone to. They go to medical school. And then after medical school, they decide that they're going to specialize in psychiatry. And so they do rotations and get training specifically in psychiatry. Psychiatrists are probably best known for giving medication. So they do a lot of medication management. They know what types of medication to give for what type of psychological disorder. And really, some psychiatrists do some therapy, but most psychiatrists really deal with medication and medication management. Psychologists are a PhD. Mine is a PsyD because I'm a doctor of psychology, but it's easier to understand as a PhD. So it's a doctorate that you earn, and you have to have your bachelor's in some sort of human behavior study. Then you would get your master's in psychology and then your doctorate in psychology. So you're studying human behavior throughout, and really if you include your internship and your residency, getting your doctorate takes about 12 years. It took me about 12 years.
As a psychologist, assuming that you actually evaluate a patient, are you able to come to a diagnosis in the same way that a psychiatrist is?
We do the same things, except the psychologists will do psychological testing. Normally, psychiatrists do not do psychological testing. They might do screeners to kind of assess and see where they're at in terms of diagnosis. But psychologists do psychological testing. Other than that, pretty much we arrive to a diagnosis the same way.
In general, and we'll talk more specifically briefly, but sort of in general, what is psychological testing?
Psychological testing can encompass many different things. It can be educational testing. We want to see someone's IQ. We want to see their achievement, how they're doing in school. It can also be leaned toward figuring out if someone has a psychological disorder. Does somebody have depression or anxiety? Are they bipolar? Are they schizophrenic? Testing will help with that. It can also tell us personality makeup. How does this person function in the world around other people and function in general? So it really depends on your referral question, what types of testing that you're going to be doing, but there's a plethora of tests that we can give for all different types of things.
Those tests that you give, are they standardized and accepted in the community as being able to render, I guess, data that helps you determine those different things that you were talking about, like IQ? So if you're giving a test and some other psychologist is giving a test for the same thing, is it going to be the same test?
Yes. Okay. So the tests are standardized. The tests also have validity scales to make sure that you're not only giving the test reliably in the right way, but the test taker is taking them in a valid way. So these tests are more objective measures. It's not just, somebody sitting back and looking at a case and then giving a diagnosis, but the testing really helps solidify that diagnosis.
I want to turn our attention to this specific case now. So you were hired by my law firm in this case, is that correct?
Yes.
And you're being paid for your time at an hourly rate, is that correct?
That's correct.
Is that common in your field?
Yes.
Okay. Are experts normally reviewing materials and coming to court for free?
No.
Okay. I want to go through what you reviewed in this case. Can you take the jury through that?
Sure, I can. I had to make a list because there's a lot. All right, so here are the records that I reviewed in this case. I had his early childhood records. I had photos of him as a child, and he had scabies on his body.
Sustained. I've seen your objection as she's testifying from the page in front of her.
No, it'd be her.
Yep. All right. Ms. Murad, you may proceed.
Thank you. Dr. Rappa, you can continue listing those items off.
Okay, the Department of State medical records, records from the Family Care International Clinic, and records from a Vietnam doctor. I had records from Family Counseling Associates, from Kathleen Martin, from 2015 and 2016. I had records from Dr. Rickenbacker from 2019, medical records from other providers, 2019 to 2013. Then I had more from 2014, 2017, and more from 2021. I had school records from Immaculate Heart Academy, and there were emails in there between the Ferriters and the school staff. I also had his school records from Basis Academy, and again, emails between the Ferriters and school staff. An April 2022 clinical summary by Kenny Miller, who diagnosed him with reactive attachment disorder. I also had his non-psychiatric medical records from 2009, 2021. I had a memorandum. It was created either by the mom or the dad, I'm not sure who, detailing the efforts that they took to get Ronin help from 2012 all the way up to 2022. I had a photo of a fractured shoulder from...
Sustained. You can state what you received or reviewed, ma'am, but you can't go into the details of what that document was.
Okay.
You may continue.
A neuropsych testing. I had an incident report from Devereaux Behavioral Health from 2022. I had Baker Act records from JFK and Central Behavioral Health in spring and summer of 2022. Emails between former foster parents in ChildNet. Interview transcripts of Alan Anderson, Kellen McCoy, and Steve Johnson. I had the CPT interviews I had both the videos and the transcripts. I had no deposition in this case, also the transcript and the video. Deposition in this case, the transcript and the video. Interview with Detective Sharp, the transcript and the video. Documents produced by a state expert. And I also watched several hours of Ring video, both the Ring video inside the room and outside the room in the home. I had the same packet that was sent to the state expert, Dr. Myers, and I had the deposition and trial testimony of Dr. Myers and the trial testimony of...
Thank you very much. So I want to talk about also what you could not review. Were you able to evaluate in this case?
No.
And was a request made for that?
Yes.
Sustained. Jury is instructed to disregard the last answer in question. You may continue, Ms. Moran.
Understood. It's fair to say that you were not, well, I will let that go. Do you...
Wait, does that mean she never actually saw this kid? She just looked at paperwork that other people wrote that saw him? That seems hinky.
So you had an opportunity to review Wade Myers' trial testimony, correct?
Yes.
So I want to sort of start with your opinions regarding the Ferriter's actions. So do you have an opinion as to whether the Ferriter's actions were therapeutically correct?
Yes.
What's that opinion?
I think the Ferriter's actions were against anything that we would ever tell someone to do therapeutically.
Is it fair to say that the way the Ferriters handled this situation probably exacerbated his behavioral issues?
Yes.
But were those behaviors that had caused by the Ferriters, in your opinion?
No, I don't believe so.
I'll get into the specifics of that in a minute. Does the fact that Tim Ferriter handled the situation as inappropriately as he did, does that change any of the opinions that you've come to in this case?
No.
Why not?
Well, I mean, I think that what we see as a child early on that had a lot of difficulty with internal controls. Most children by the age of 5, if you want to kind of push it to 6, have already learned how to control themselves. They can control their behaviors. They don't tantrum. They can control, if they feel like they want to do something, they can control impulses. But I did see through the records that this was a child that had no internal controls. And lots of times when a parent has a child that has no internal controls, they do try to put external controls around that child. This, of course, was beyond the pale. But those external controls are not something that is an unusual thing for a parent to do if they feel like the child is a danger to themselves, others, or is doing something so impulsively, and they need to keep an eye on them.
Okay. I want for the jury to establish sort of the timeline that I think is relevant in this case. So I'm going to state his testimony and let me know if it's correct. And this is the testimony from the trial that you reviewed.
Objection, improper.
Approach. All right, the objection is sustained. Ms. Murad, you can rephrase the question. Thank you.
So I want to go through some of the underlying facts that you relied on in coming to your opinion, okay?
Yes.
And specifically about when locks were placed on the store, okay? So is it your understanding, or were you assuming this when coming to your opinion, that this was born on February 28th of 2019?
Yes.
And that a room in the garage in Arizona was made about a week prior to that?
Yes.
And that a lock was placed on a room inside the home in Arizona that lived in while Tracy was pregnant?
Yes.
Given that was born in late February, is it fair to say that that has to be between about May 2018 and February 2019 at some point?
Yes.
Okay. I want to start by talking about some of the facts that Wade Myers relied on in his testimony. You already stated that you reviewed his trial testimony and his deposition, correct?
Yes.
Wade Myers testified that he did not have any substantial behavioral issues before the age of 8 or 9. Without getting into any specifics, is that a true fact based on your review of the records?
Objection.
Sustained.
Judge, can we approach on this?
You can.
Okay, I guess Meg didn't cut this sidebar out. Yeah, I had forgotten that the other expert hadn't seen him either. I just wouldn't want to be talking about a kid's mental health if I hadn't actually seen him. That just seems weird.
All right, the objection is sustained without prejudice. Ms. Murad, for you to rephrase.
Without getting into specific acts, have you reviewed evidence that shows that there were, in fact, behavioral issues prior?
Object. Is motion eliminated?
Sorry, I need you to approach again. All right, Ms. Murad, you may continue.
Thank you. Did you rely on records that showed and had behavioral issues prior to the age of 8 and 9 in coming to your various opinions in this case?
Yes.
Did you also rely on records that showed that did in fact have school suspensions?
Yes.
Would you characterize the time that was spent in his room, would you characterize that as him having experienced solitary confinement for 3 consecutive years?
Not really, in terms of, you think about 3 full years of somebody being in solitary confinement where they're having no stimulation, they're not getting out of their room, nothing is going on like that. So no, I saw videos where he was out of the room, where he was eating with the family, where he was in the cul-de-sac or playing with the dog out back. One, he was helping them clean up the yard. One, he was helping them all move in the house. One, he and Tim were sitting at a table having lunch together. Videos where he's watching football with the family. So no, I didn't see it as, he was locked in a room at the minute he gets home and then he's never let out of that room until school time.
Were those videos that you reviewed Ring camera videos from the time period in Jupiter?
Yes.
Did you also review videos of him participating in meals with the family?
Yes.
Is there any evidence in the record that was only provided leftovers to eat?
Sustained.
Did you rely on any evidence in the record that showed that it was only given leftovers to eat?
Overruled as to that question. You can answer, ma'am.
No, I did not see in records where he was only given leftovers to eat.
Okay. Okay, I want to get into your sort of specific opinions at this point. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not it has a lack of inhibition and emotional regulation?
Yes.
What is your opinion as to that issue?
I believe that struggles and has clinically significant signs of lack of inhibition and emotional regulation.
What did you rely on in coming to that opinion?
Well, there were a number of things, but one thing in particular is he had a neuropsych done in 2022. And so that report was very helpful to me in determining how his brain was functioning.
You said neuropsych. What is that?
Neuropsychological testing is a psychologist that focuses on that focuses on the brain, and the testing then shows skills and abilities that the brain is able to do.
Is neuropsychological testing something that you routinely review in your practice?
Yes.
And is that both your clinical and forensic practice?
Yes.
Do you personally administer some neuropsychological tests or the tests that were administered in this case?
Sure. The vast majority of tests that were administered in that case that the neuropsychologist did, I give.
Okay. So can you take us through what the different parts of a neuropsychological test are? And I have it in front of me, should you require your recollection to be refreshed. Would that help?
I think I have it too.
Okay.
So a neuropsychological is very similar to a psychological evaluation. The difference is that they focus more on brain functioning. So they're looking at, how what are their skills, their abilities, and how their brain is functioning. In this particular case, the doctor did get background information. I believe he spoke with mom. He also had records that he reviewed. He gave neuropsych testing. He gave quite a bit of neuropsych testing, scored that testing, and then he did what we call a mental status exam, meaning you have the patient in front of you and you're actually asking them questions, seeing how they reason, seeing if they are logical and relevant, watching their behavior, watching their mood and their affect, and you're trying to determine, where they are at that moment in time in terms of their psychological stability. So he also had that as part of his evaluation. And then he wrote up a report telling all the information that he got from the testing, from the interviews, from everything.
You stated that the neuropsychological testing includes information from mom. Is there, how do you determine if that's biased or not?
Well, you're going to have to get information from caretakers. That's just part of what we have to do to get full information. You can absolutely look at the information that you're given, and you can see, do records back that up? Is there anything that backs up what I'm being told? When you're giving testing to a parent or a child, that testing has validity scales. So you can tell through that testing if a parent's totally very negative toward a child, overly positive, thinking their kids have, halo and wings. You can tell these things in the testing, so that kind of gives you an idea of if someone's being truthful or not. And the same with the patients, the same with the person that you're interviewing.
What did the validity testing in this neuropsychological evaluation reveal about Tracy Ferriter's responses regarding objection as to relevance?
Let me have your approach.
Based on your review of the neuropsychological testing, do you have any concerns about the validity of that testing?
No.
What in the neuropsychological testing has informed your opinion?
There were a couple of things that stood out to me. He did an IQ test. He did an achievement test. The doctor did an IQ test also did an achievement test for. Those things were pretty standard. He also gave him what is called the brief, which is a test that looks at executive functioning, meaning frontal lobe of the brain, pretty much. How is someone functioning in terms of their brain and their behaviors? That testing was interesting to me. On that test, scored within the clinically significant range. When we say clinically significant, meaning it's above what somebody would just normally be. So it's clinically significant, and it's something that is going to be kind of on our radar. So on the inhibit scale, he scored clinically elevated, meaning that it's very hard for him to be in control of himself, especially with peers in the classroom. He requires a lot of adult supervision. His self-monitor scale was also clinically elevated, meaning it's very hard for him to understand the effect that his behavior has on others. He doesn't really have any insight into how he presents to others and what he's doing to others with his behavior. He also had a clinically elevated score for emotional control, meaning when he is flooded with emotion, he can't moderate that. He is explosive with his emotion, whether it's rage or screaming or breaking things, whatever. It's very hard for him to manage emotions, and especially anger. And just his regular emotional regulation index was very high. And, this is important to me, and it informs my opinion, because we see when children have been traumatized, and normally very early childhood trauma will create a child that has huge problems with inhibition, emotional control, and they are completely unaware that, everything that's going on around them is because of them.
So you mentioned just now that this is about sort of what happens in early childhood. You also mentioned that these are tests of executive functioning. So let's start with this. When is executive functioning developed in a person?
Well, executive functioning is ongoing, right? So the brain is continuing to grow, and the brain might continue to grow into adulthood until the 20s or in the 30s in some case. So, so that's a dynamic process. When we see things like in this testing, normally we can relate it back to children in early childhood, because it's early childhood where we learn to manage our emotions, to not act out, to kind of be aware of how we are and what our peers think about us. And so that's a pivotal point where that part of the brain can be damaged, and then we can start to see testing like this.
Is it your opinion that the results that had come from early childhood neglect?
I'm sorry, say that one more time?
Sure. The results that we're seeing on the neuropsychological test, is it your opinion that those resulted from early childhood neglect?
Yes, that is my opinion.
Why is that your opinion?
I feel like that the early childhood neglect that we see in him from, being in a foreign orphanage, and from the records that I reviewed from that orphanage show, not only did he have severe neglect and was malnourished, they were feeding the children sugar water in one of the records, and there was a very high infant to caretaker ratio, so that caretakers can't take care of all these babies that are in the orphanage, so they didn't get their needs met. He also had scabies on his body that were not treated medically. So this is a child that was severely neglected. We have no idea what happened to him the first 7 months of life before he was put on the orphanage door. We have no idea the neglect or the abuse. But I think that when you see that type of neglect, there is definite brain reaction from that. There's no way that you can have a child that is being neglected, and really, if you think about being ignored or the scabies, like even medically neglected and abused, that would not have some kind of brain fallout because of that.
To state the obvious, is that prior to the Ferriters adopting him?
Yes.
When was this neuropsychological test conducted, if you have it on there?
I will look. October of 2022.
Is the fact that if it was after January 28th, 2022, change your opinion about the fact that this has to do with early childhood neglect for women?
No.
Why not?
I mean, I feel like if this testing had been done, even 2 years before, we probably would have seen a very, very similar pattern. We probably would have even seen a similar pattern when he was younger, because we can tell through the records that this is impulse control, self-monitoring, emotional regulation. These were things he consistently had problems with across all settings.
Is there any evidence in the records that any of the physicians or psychiatrists or social workers that the Ferriters went to recommended a neuropsychological evaluation?
No, I never saw that recommendation.
I now want to talk about another opinion in this case. Do you have any opinions about whether or not it has symptoms that are indicative of an attachment disorder?
Yes.
What's your opinion?
I do believe that his symptoms are an indicative of an attachment disorder.
Why?
So first of all, I see reactive attachment disorder was diagnosed in the records for him, starting as early as I believe he was 7 or 8. I don't know that at 7 or 8 they had fully diagnosed it, but the therapist was telling the parents, hey, I think this is more than what I thought it was, and I think I think it might be reactive attachment disorder. And then it was more formally diagnosed by a psychiatrist a couple of years after that. So I not only see it in the records, but also in terms of the behaviors that we were seeing and through the records point to a child that's having problems with attachment and pretty significant behaviors because of it.
So let me stop you there because I want to understand what an attachment disorder is. So what's attachment?
Well, attachment is the most fundamental, basic thing that children need in order to be successful in life, in order to make friends, have intimate partners, being good at their job. Being able to attach to people means that you have stability, you have empathy because you can understand what someone else is feeling, not just yourself. It also helps you establish trust so that you can have a relationship where you can be independent and someone can trust you and you can trust them that they're going to meet your needs if you need it. When children early on don't get that, there's a whole disruption that happens that affects every part of their life because we're social creatures. And if you're not able to trust people and navigate life socially, then there's a problem and it leads to what we call a disorder.
When is attachment developed in a person?
A lot of attachment issues have been looked at, of course, in my field, because it is such an important issue and a lot of things hinge on your ability to attach in a healthy way. Normally what we see is there's a cycle of attachment from the moment that child is born. So what we see in the cycle is a child that is born, and let's say that child is wet or soiled or hungry or cold. That child starts crying. Immediately an adult comes, a caretaker comes, picks up that child, takes care of that child, soothes that child. The child's then able to self-regulate, go back to sleep, or whatever they're doing. This cycle occurs thousands of times with parents. If you've ever had a newborn, it's constant. And if you're constantly going after that newborn every time they cry, soothing that newborn, helping that newborn then learns, I have someone I can trust, I have someone I can attach to, and I know that if I get out of control or I need something, there's an adult that's going to come along and that adult is going to help me. Children that do not get this, there's an interruption in that attachment. So you can imagine all the things. They don't trust that anyone will ever take care of them. They don't trust that their needs will be met. They can't see the world from anyone else's perspective. So attachment is a huge thing.
When we talk about attachment, what separates attachment disorder from a kid that's just kind of awkward? Because it sounds like it's something that affects the personality, but is it just that you kind of end up being uncomfortable or awkward, or are there other behaviors associated with having an attachment disorder?
When you have a disorder in general, so I'll talk in general first. When you have a disorder, a lot of people, you'll hear people say, oh my gosh, I've got bipolar, I'm so moody, or oh, that kid's got ADHD, he's so hyper. It's not just something that's at the level that we normally see in life. It's at a level that we think that it is clinically significant, and it's a disorder. It's disrupting their life. It's disrupting the lives of people around them. So just because the nature of the disorder means that this is something that's hugely problematic, and hugely problematic not just to the person that has it, but to the other people that are around that person. And in terms of attachment disorder in particular, what we normally see, so normally you'll get a child that has reactive attachment disorder. They come out of a very bad environment. They go into a home that's loving and kind and has stability and structure. We normally see that the child begins to get better. So the attachment disorder gets better. There are children who have what we call persistent reactive attachment disorder, where the damage was so severe in childhood that as they get older, we don't necessarily see that damage start to go away. If they're plugged into the right therapies and they know the right places to go, and some of them, have to go to higher levels of care, then we might see some sort of healing, but it's something that they will struggle with, for some of these kids, for their life.
What behaviors are associated with reactive attachment disorder?
Overall,
Go ahead. What behaviors are associated with reactive attachment disorder?
So when you look at, so when we diagnose, as psychologists, as psychiatrists, anyone in the mental health field, we have to use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So this tells us what signs and symptoms to look for and how to diagnose. So if you're going to look up reactive attachment disorder in the DSM, you're going to just find pretty much a general way of looking at symptoms. So it will be that the child cannot be soothed by their caretaker. The caretaker tries when the child is out of control to soothe them, and the child wants none of it and continues to tantrum. Or the child doesn't go to that caretaker for the caretaker to take care of them. Most children, when they get hurt, run to their parent. No, these children do not. They kind of keep the parent away. So there's kind of a general way of describing reactive attachment disorder when you see it in your practice. However, when you start to look at when people are studying this issue, what you will see is that there are certain behaviors that are kind of indicative of a kid that has reactive attachment disorder. And it would include lying, frequent lying for no good reason, just lies that make no sense. It can be aggression, it can be violence, it can be being mean to animals, being mean to younger children, stealing, hoarding. Food is a big issue for children with reactive attachment disorder. So they gorge on food or they steal food. They're constantly food preoccupied. Some of them don't eat. So it really just depends on, how that is manifesting in each individual child. But it's a significant psychological disorder when you see the symptoms involved of children whose reactive attachment disorder did not get better just because they were put in a loving home.
What, in coming to your opinion that has behaviors indicative of attachment disorder, what are you relying on, or can you explain to us how you came to that opinion?
Yeah, so there's multiple records that talk about the behaviors that the family was seeing and dealing with in the home, from psychiatrist, from a treatment provider in 2015, all the way up. All the way up to now, we see these behaviors. So it was pretty well documented that the behaviors that were being seen were indicative of a reactive attachment disorder. The lying, the stealing, especially the food issues, just almost everything. Cruelty to animals or being mean to animals. I'm not going to say cruel like horrible, but being mean to animals, being mean to younger, more vulnerable children. These types of things we do see in his history.
And does that predate, let's say, about May of 2018?
The very first record I saw where the family was really describing the behaviors that they were dealing with was 2015. So I believe he was 7 or 8 at that time.
You talked a little bit about gorging being common for children with attachment disorder. Can you sort of take us through what happens and why that happens?
Well, I think it's easy to understand. If you are starving as an infant and nobody is feeding you, then your brain has learned that you can be hungry and you're not going to get taken care of. You're not going to get fed. So it becomes a preoccupation with food, a preoccupation on how do I get food, and when I do get food, I want to eat every single thing that I can eat immediately. Or I'm going to hoard food. I'm going to hide food in my room. I'm going to hide food in my backpack so that I'll always have food. It's really very sad because it really is from a brain that was so deprived of basic needs.
Okay, I gotta say something. She said that parents do this to try to fix their kid, and she said that what they did was beyond the pale, which to me that means like she's saying they went overboard with it. But did they, at the beginning, did they try to use love and positive reinforcement to change the behavior, or did they go right to locking them in a box? Because that is just going to have the opposite effect. No kid is going to thrive when they're isolated like that. Okay, off my soapbox now.
And now even, into childhood, they're still struggling with that kind of stuff. And we see that with a lot of food-centric ideas and wanting to get a hold of food, and not having any kind of breaks on food when he does get a hold of something sweet, to the point of even stealing food.
Is that sort of gorging of food and hoarding of food, I mean, is that healthy for a child? Should a parent allow that to continue to happen?
No, you wouldn't allow a child to gorge on food.
Is there any indication in the record that the Ferriters were educated by a psychiatrist or a medical professional about how to handle this gorging issue in a meaningful way?
Sustained. You can rephrase, Ms. Moran.
Sure. Do you have any opinion, and we'll talk about this more in detail, as to whether the Ferriters acted with malice?
Do I have an opinion? Yes.
Okay, what's that opinion?
I do not think that they were maliciously trying to harm their child and make things worse.
I want to talk about that in more detail in a little bit, but as it relates to the food, why do you think that?
Well, I don't understand.
Sure. So I want to talk about your opinion regarding them not having malice and what they did, but as it relates to and how much he was permitted to eat, what is your opinion about that and the fact that they were not acting maliciously?
Oh, okay. So I think that not only in his deposition, but also in the deposition of his sister, they do talk about that the mother was very health conscious, that the mother didn't want the children having sugary snacks. They mentioned the snacks that she allowed them to have. And forgive me if I'm wrong, but it was stuff like granola and yogurt and bananas and things like that. The sister testified in her...
Sustained.
Without stating exactly what said, can you just talk more generally about your opinion?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So I believe that the mother was trying very hard to make sure that didn't get too much sugar.
Sustained.
What is your in determining, so I guess not speaking about your beliefs, but what the records actually show, what efforts were made by the Ferriters that makes you believe that it was not malicious?
Objection as to your claim.
Overruled, but the witness is instructed not to relate what anyone said to you, just what you reviewed and what drives your opinion.
Go ahead.
According to the records, a pediatrician told mom not to give.
Sustained.
Do you have any belief, is it your opinion that the Ferriters were withholding food from him intentionally to harm him?
No.
Is it your opinion that it is related to the fact that he was hoarding food as a result of his earlier condition?
Objection calls for speculation.
Overruled as to that. You can answer, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. How are children with attachment perceived by adults who are not their parents?
Oh, that's a good question.
Can you restate that question again?
Sure. How are children with attachment perceived by adults who are not their parents?
Sustained.
Can we approach on this, Judge?
Can. You may continue, Ms. Murad. The objection is sustained.
I don't understand that question.
Is reactive attachment disorder associated sometimes in children with a level of manipulation?
Objection. Relevance.
Approach. All right, the objection is overruled with directions to counsel to rephrase the question.
With reactive attachment disorder, is manipulation by the child who is diagnosed, is that common?
Yes.
Okay, can you explain that to us?
Yes, so these are children that want control over their environments. They don't trust adults. They are, looking for ways not only to seek attention, but also to manipulate, to get their needs met. They feel like they have to manipulate to get their needs met, rather than being direct about it, because their needs were never met directly.
Is your opinion that also exhibited these behaviors that are indicative of reactive attachment disorder?
Yes.
Explain that to us without getting into anything prior to his age of about 9 or 10.
Okay. Are you asking me what
What
in
behaviors
general,
did
when
exhibit?
before 9 and 10?
Oh,
Dr.
no, I'm
Rappa,
sorry.
Dr. Rappa, can you pull the mic a little closer to
I'm
you?
sorry.
So you're picked up better. All right, thank
got
you.
it.
No, I'm sorry. I'm asking you to talk about specific behaviors in the record that have led you to that opinion without getting into the specifics of anything prior to the age of 8 or 9.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
9 or 10.
Thank you for the clarification.
No problem.
Yes, so manipulation by Roman. He's a very interesting child. So at one point,
I'm going to sustain the objection. You can restate the question, and we'll hear the answer again.
Is there, and on what basis, Your Honor?
I'm sorry?
On what basis is it sustained?
Her opinion as to whether he's interesting or not is not relevant to the case.
Okay, without saying that he's interesting, could you explain what behaviors you reviewed in the record that are helping inform your opinion?
okay. So in the record, there were
Overruled. You can state what you reviewed, ma'am, and how it informed your opinion, but you cannot go into detail about what specifically was said because that's hearsay. So you have to be able to answer the question posed by your attorney without disclosing specifically what was said by someone outside of this courtroom.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Do you understand that instruction?
I think.
All right, well, we'll see if you can
Yeah, see
follow.
if I don't.
All right, thank you. Go ahead.
So what records did you review that indicated that?
School records, also records of when he would go to the doctor or saw the psychologist or psychiatrist.
Did you have an opportunity to review the video deposition of?
Yes.
And that was about 5 hours?
Yes.
Is there anything about the way in which it presents that also is indicative of attachment disorder?
I mean, I don't know that you would look at him and you would say that the way you present is, an attachment disorder. But the things that I noticed in the deposition or that were kind of flags for me as a psychologist, he is very kind of detached from what he talks about. He can talk about it in an intellectual way, but he doesn't necessarily talk about it in an emotional way. So he kind of gives you facts without necessarily having that emotional congruence with the facts. One of the things that is interesting to me is that during the deposition, he was pretty blunt affect. He doesn't have a whole lot of affect on his face, whether it's, joy or anger or anything, it's kind of blunted. However, during times where he would talk about things that he had done, such as giving beer to his younger brother, and to see the effects of alcohol on young children, he started giggling. Or he would laugh when he would talk about that he went into his sister's classroom.
Overruled. You can only say what his observations were and his response, but not what he said specifically. So overruled.
Go ahead, Dr. Rappa.
So he would laugh at inappropriate things that he had done. But other than that type of laughter, he was pretty blunted in terms of his affect.
Why? I think you called it congruence. What do you mean by congruence?
It's really important when we're communicating with people that we are congruent. So what we're feeling is what we're showing to that person. If you're feeling something and not necessarily showing it, then people can kind of pick up that you're incongruent, something is going on with you, and it leads to lack of trust. So it's important. Congruence is important. It's also important because it makes somebody predictable, so that if you say something to me and I know that you are someone who what you say is exactly what you feel, then I can trust you and I can predict your behavior towards me. When people are not congruent, you can't necessarily predict their behavior towards you, because what they're saying and what they're actually feeling are two different things. So the congruence is a huge issue in relationships.
Why is that concerning for children in particular? That lack of congruence.
A lack of congruence in children, one of the things that an adult role is to teach children to be congruent, to teach children what you're feeling is what you need to be speaking, in a respectful way, but you need to speak your feelings. If they don't have that, then the child is an unpredictable child, because the child can parrot back to you what they know you want to hear, but they're not necessarily changing anything internally.
What is the treatment for an attachment disorder? What are the treatments?
There are treatments for attachment disorder. There are also some treatments for attachment disorder that are very, off the cuff and not good treatments, and nobody really, and professionals would recommend them. But the treatment right now for attachment disorder, most people would treat it as a trauma-based disorder, and they would do trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy or regular cognitive behavioral therapy. There's dialectical therapy. There's certain therapies that are known to work with children that have attachment issues.
Were any of those ever recommended to the Ferriters?
Sustained.
Is it your opinion that the Ferriters were, do you have an opinion as to whether the Ferriters acted with malice when it comes to the treatment of attachment disorder?
Yes.
Okay, what is that?
Mara, can you approach for a second? All right, so the court is reconsidering its prior ruling on the question of whether there were any recommended treatments. Ms. Murad, you can ask the witness that question with respect to her review of the records that she had presented to her in this matter. But, ma'am, just so you know, you're only able to answer that question with respect to the records you reviewed. You're not allowed to get into that with respect to anything else anybody else may have said to you, because that would be hearsay. But if there's something in the records that can form a basis for you to answer the question, I'll allow you to do that. Okay?
Thank you, Your Honor. Based on the records that you reviewed and coming to your various opinions in this case, is there any evidence that the Ferriters were recommended those treatments that you just mentioned?
No.
Is there any evidence in the records that you reviewed that they were recommended inpatient treatment for attachment disorder?
No.
Is there any evidence in the record that the Ferriters were recommended to go to a specialist for attachment disorders?
No.
And just so we're clear, Ms. Murad, you're talking about the records that she reviewed, not in the record in the global sense of this proceeding.
Just the ones you have. Yes. All right. I want to go into, Your Honor, my next opinion does require me to approach. I'm wondering if it's a good time for a break.
Yeah, it is good, because we've been going about an hour and a half this morning. So we'll take a break, 15-minute break. It's almost 10:30. We'll be in recess until 10. All right, everyone may be seated. All right, you need to approach?
Could we just do it?
We can do it
Here. So, Judge, in my opinion, the court has sort of made a preliminary ruling on this, but I wanted to readdress it before I asked Dr. Rappa. So in the cross-examination, actually I think it was in the direct or redirect examination of Wade Myers opined that when you remove a child from the environment that they're in that's causing issues with their attachment. So specifically, and we listened to this yesterday, so Wade Myers agreed that he has probably an attachment disorder from his early childhood when he was adopted. He then said that it was, quote, brought back by the Ferriters. And he then said that if he is placed in a different situation or environment, or children with attachment issues are placed in a different situation or environment, you expect to see an improvement in their behavior. And so I believe, based on the records that Dr. Rappa has reviewed, that at the very least, the defense should be able to counter that position to show that that improvement has not in fact happened, because there is an issue here of the persistent reactive attachment disorder and how the Ferriters couldn't have really done anything to improve it. And it is direct rebuttal to what the state's own expert testified to. So I would like to get into that, and I'm sure the state will be objecting.
All right, so Ms. Coakley, make sure you use a mic and state what your position is.
Yeah, I mean, the state would object. I think that there is a fundamental difference between saying generally this is how it is addressed, which is what Dr. Rappa has already testified to, that generally how it's addressed is that it focuses on the parenting in a nurturing, safe parenting environment. There's a fundamental difference between that testimony and saying that that would have solved it in this case, which is not what his testimony was. He testified generally. Beyond that, it's much more complex and nuanced than the defense wants to make it seem. It's not an automatic solution. I don't think any psychiatrist or psychologist would say that, especially after 3 years of additional trauma perpetrated by the defendants, then to go into every single thing that has occurred to the child after.
So what is the legal basis of your objection? Is it foundation? Is it relevancy?
It's improper character evidence, Your Honor. And whether or not the child in this case was cured after being removed from the parents is not a relevant determination for the jury. That doesn't have any bearing on whether or not the defendants committed a criminal act in this case. Whether
That sounds like a relevancy objection to me as well.
Right. It's like nuance. So it's like the idea is first that it's improper character evidence that confuses the issues and is prejudicial because it gets into such a complicated issue. But so it's Your Honor in limine said that is not permissible. It's improper character evidence.
And that's right, and that's why Ms. Murad said I'd already preliminarily ruled on it.
But beyond that, it's not even relevant because like how easy or how hard it was to manage their child is not a defense to the criminal charge here. And so whether or not he was able to or continue to have behaviors after they were removed is not relevant to the determination of the defendant's intent or knowledge in this case, or whether or not they committed a criminal act of child abuse.
All right, final remarks on it, Ms. Murad. And I'll help you out with at least the concern I have is I think it's completely irrelevant whether the child gets well or not after he's removed from the home, because I agree with the state's position that whether the child gets better or not does not decide the issue of whether the treatment and the conduct of the parents in dealing with the child prior to the child's removal was appropriate or not to the circumstances. You've testified as to the circumstances that, or you've had your witness testify as to the circumstances that existed while the child was at home, and that was with the reactive attachment disorder. So that's appropriate, but now, and that's relevant because that's what they're dealing with in real time, and it guides and determines their conduct, their response to a minor child having reactive attachment disorder. But what happens after the child's removed, I have a real difficult time connecting the dots because it's irrelevant to the parent's conduct that they pursued while the child was with them and while they were dealing with the issue. So that's my major concern, is it's just not relevant. And why should I change my pretrial ruling already made in this case that I wasn't going to allow this area of an opinion and conduct to be looked at?
So the reason I think the court should reconsider its ruling is because the state has made it relevant. Everything that the court is saying in the state's sort of argument in the second half of their argument is the same thing that we litigated in motions in limine. We are now in a different posture. The state could have instructed their expert, do not say anything that could create an issue with what's happened after the fact. We all do that with motion in limines, and we instruct our witnesses, don't testify like this, don't bring this up. Now it has become relevant. So the reason it's not improper character evidence, as the court knows, is only inadmissible to the extent that it goes to show propensity. That's not what we're doing here. They have had an expert, a doctor, testify that when you remove a child from that situation, they will get better. And he may have said that generally, but we're in a case here about his behavior and whether or not the Ferriters are guilty or not guilty. Now, I understand the state's position as to, these are perpetrated by the Ferriters. Their version of the theory of their case is not, I do not have to abide by that. I certainly understand that there are relevance objections and everything, but their version of their case they can present. I don't have to present that version.
Okay. I recall well the underpinnings of my ruling pre-trial on this, and I can tell you that my ruling was informed by much more than just a relevancy consideration, but it was also informed by significant case law that had been presented to me regarding the privacy interest of the victim in this case. And it was because of that and a substantial amount of authority that weighed in heavy favor of not allowing this type of information to be pursued with a victim in general, but a child victim in particular. So I'm going to sustain the state's objection, maintain my pretrial ruling and my order in limine on this. So with that, I'm going to give, do you need anything else? I'm going to give you a break until for you to
Can I
continue.
just proffer the questions?
You can proffer the question. That'll be fine. Go ahead, Ms. Moran.
Thank you. Wade Myers opined that when you remove a child from an abusive environment, you expect to see improvement in their behavior. In general, do you agree with that? We're just proffering, so you have to answer it. When would you not agree? Are there circumstances where that's not the case?
Sure. If the child has real significant psychiatric problems, then we're not going to necessarily see it remit just because they're put in a different placement.
In this particular case, is there evidence that has in fact improved since his removal from the Ferriter home?
I'm just going to object because
This is proffer.
I know it's proper, but we're in open court here. This information was protected pursuant to multiple privileges, and so now to put it on a televised.
I think that's a fair objection. Let me have both sides approach.
When is our break until Judge? I'm sorry.
All right, so the court is going to sustain the objection. It's without prejudice to the defense to do a written proffer with a confidential filing, because the court has found previously that the minor victim's treatment post removal from the home is protected information, and it would violate his privacy interest to have that disclosed publicly. So I'm maintaining that ruling, maintaining that protection that I originally ordered. However, I also acknowledge the defense's right to put on a proffer of what evidence it would have submitted but for my ruling, and I will allow that to be done in a way that it is not public at this point. You can do a sealed proffer for filing that will become part of the record going forward. Ms. Murad, anything else before we've chewed up the break, but I'm going to still give you 5 or 10 minutes. Anything from state? All right, so we're going to take a brief recess, ma'am. You can step down, stretch your legs, but during the break, you're not to discuss your testimony with anyone. You understand all that? All right. Thank you. Court will be in recess for another 10 minutes. All right, everyone may be seated. Ms. Murad, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rappa, we talked about reactive attachment disorder. I now want to turn to something else that you mentioned during the course of your direct examination. Do you have an opinion as to whether one has symptoms indicative of oppositional defiant disorder?
Yes.
What is that?
Approach. All right, the objection is sustained. You may continue, Ms. Moran.
Do you have any opinion as to whether one has PTSD?
Yes.
What's your opinion?
I do believe he has signs and symptoms consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
What is complex? Well, let me start with this. What is your opinion as to when that complex PTSD started?
I believe that it started when he was an infant, when he was a very, very small child, up until the time he was around almost 2.
Explain that to us. How are you able to make that determination?
Well, post-traumatic stress disorder in infants is something that has recently been looked at. People thought, oh no, they're newborns or they're young children, they don't remember anything, and nothing in their environment really impacts them, so it doesn't matter. Nothing really can be further from the truth when you start to look at it, and when it is studied. So children that have had adverse childhood experiences, whether it's trauma or severe neglect or medical neglect, anything like that, can cause signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder in infancy.
So when you're determining whether or not a child has complex PTSD that's rooted in issues from infancy, are you relying on the DSM-5?
No, normally what you're going to rely on when you're diagnosing a young child is called a diagnostic classification 0 to 3. So it looks at young children and then it looks at what behaviors young children might exhibit, as opposed to the DSM, which does talk about children with PTSD, but really doesn't deal with early life experiences.
Is it your opinion that the Ferriters caused the complex PTSD that one has?
No, I mean, I think that it's a complicated mix of reactive attachment disorder and complex PTSD due to everything that he went through from birth until like 17 months of age.
And without discussing the substance of the records or any hearsay, is there evidence prior to about May of 2018 in the record that supports that has symptoms indicative of complex PTSD and reactive attachment disorder?
Yes, and sometimes these disorders mirror each other. So when you have young children, they really can't communicate. So the way that they are communicating is through their behaviors. Therefore, if you see some children, that's why you'll see lots of times when you're looking at records of young children, you'll see that different providers are giving them different diagnoses because some of them are similar or they mirror each other. Because again, children can't tell you what's going on with them. You have to see it through their behaviors and what the parent is experiencing at home.
We discussed earlier on, I guess I'll call it part one of this direct examination, about congruence and trust. Could you remind us about that, about the role of trust in human relationships?
Sustained.
So without reminding us about what you said, how is trust involved in the parent-child relationship?
Throughout you raising your children, trust is involved. You're teaching your children that you have to be able to trust them, and as they get a little bit older, you're giving them a little more independence. You're watching to see how they handle it. If they start to handle it badly, then you take away a little bit of independence, and so that trust between you and the child grows in that way. If you have a teenager and you let them use your car and they stay out too late, you take the car. I mean, that's good parenting. That's just parents that are teaching children, hey, I'm gonna let you get a little independent, but if you show that I can't trust you, I'm gonna pull back. And that's exactly how parents raise children that then learn to be responsible and accountable.
What behaviors are associated with a lack of trust, or someone that, perhaps someone would not feel comfortable trusting?
Objection, relevant, speculation.
Sustained.
What evidence in the records have you reviewed that, well, let me ask it this way. Do you believe that a lack of trust, and I'm talking about this in terms of like psychology, your field, is there evidence in the record of doing activities that are not trustworthy?
Yes.
Object, improper opinion.
I didn't catch the last part of that. That are not what?
Trustworthy, just because we're using that language in the psychological sense, Judge.
So is this a psychological opinion you're asking, or just her?
Psychological opinion, Judge.
And what's the basis of the objection? Sustained. Commenting on the credibility.
Not commenting. So let me start with this. What are behaviors that indicate that's a lack of trust?
I'm going to object to relevance.
Sustained.
If you have someone who is doing things like stealing or lying, are those behaviors that show that, they're tied to like manipulation or dishonesty? Is that fair to say?
Objection, improper opinion, improper character evidence.
Sustained.
Can you
Let me have you approach. All right, the objection sustained. You may rephrase, Ms. Marone.
Does trust affect how a parent responds to a child?
Yes.
Explain that to us, please.
Yes, so as a child proves themselves to be more trustworthy and doing things that are, they're accountable and they're responsible, then the parent learns to trust that child, gives them more independence, and, the child moves on into adulthood.
In your review of the records in this case, is there indication that the Ferriters responded to that lack of trust from
Objection, speculation.
Overruled. You have to answer that with reference to what you actually viewed as far as the records that drives your opinion or answer.
Go ahead.
So will you ask it one more time?
Sure. Is there evidence in the record that that sort of the parents' response to that lack of trust happened in this case?
Yes.
Okay. Without discussing the specific information in the record, explain to us how you've come to that conclusion.
100%.
It's hard. So there would be behaviors by whether it was at school or at home, and those behaviors would elicit a consequence.
Is there, how do parents, again, I'm talking about in psychology, when a parent sees sort of a lack of trust, how does that parent respond?
Normally, what you will see is a parent that tries to gain control of that child. So the more the child seems out of control, or the more the child seems untrustworthy, the more the parent then tries to put control on them, put external control around, or keep them somehow, safe, or whatever the parent is going through at that time. So I think the parent's initial reaction is to clamp down and be more controlling of a child that they feel like is out of control.
Is that a normal or natural response by a parent in that type of situation?
Yes, in my experience working with parents, that's the first thing they try to do, is to see if they can't gain some control over a situation they feel is out of control.
I now want to get into another opinion of yours. So you did, in fact, review the trial testimony and the deposition of Dr. Wade Myers, correct?
Yes.
And Dr. Wade Myers testified that the Ferriters engaged in malicious punishment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not the Ferriters did, in fact, engage in malicious punishment?
Yes.
What is that opinion?
I don't believe that they were malicious insofar as they were deliberately trying to abuse and hurt their child. I think that they were responding to behaviors that they were very concerned about, and they were trying, it's almost like they went into a let's contain and monitor and make sure that nothing's going to happen. Did they do something appropriate? No. Did they handle it appropriately? No. But I don't think it was just an arbitrary, I'm going to abuse this child, be cruel to this child, for no reason. I think in their mind, they were trying to contain some behaviors and keep everybody safe in the process.
There are records that indicate that the Ferriters went from sort of provider to provider, perhaps not staying with one for a very extended period of time. Do you have an opinion about that?
Sure, I see that happen all the time. Unfortunately, I wish I could say that all mental health professionals are excellent at what they do, but that's not necessarily the case. And sometimes you go to a provider that, what they're dealing with is a little over their head, or what they're not trained in evidence-based treatment, so they're trying to do talk therapy with a 7-year-old, which doesn't work. And lots of times I think that even us as clinicians, we kind of sit back in our world of theory, and this is how things are supposed to be theoretically, and this is how you make a perfect family, and this is how you do it. And so you just tell your child, you need to talk about your feelings, and every time the child is out of control, you sit down and calm them and say, talk this out with me. That's theory, and it's beautiful parenting, but it doesn't always work when the gravel hits the road. So lots of times parents will, in my experience, get frustrated at mental health providers because mental health providers try to make it sound like it's just so easy to do, but they're not the ones that go home with a child that's tantruming for an hour or an hour and a half, and they don't know how to soothe them.
We've talked about a couple potential diagnoses for, is the actual specific diagnosis really does that determine whether or not you believe that there was malicious punishment? Like the specific diagnosis that may or may not have?
No, I mean, I don't think the specific diagnosis. I think in terms of maliciousness, maliciousness for me would mean that somebody would be arbitrarily abusing somebody with the purpose of making things worse for them. I think that when we see the behaviors that were being displayed and some of the behaviors that were happening, that they weren't necessarily being malicious. They were trying to contain and control it in a very inappropriate way.
Do you have an opinion as to whether, based on the records that you reviewed, and was a danger to himself and others?
You can approach. We're going to take a 5-minute break. Council needs to review something before we proceed further. All right, go ahead and have the jury retire to the jury room. All right, and it's going to be 5 minutes sharp, Ms. Murad. If you don't have what you intend to present to the court, we're moving on. It was disclosed. I'll look at it. Yes, go ahead.
So, Judge, Dr. Rappa was deposed twice, once on September 20th by the state, a second time on September 27th by the state. The state asked on the bottom of page 11 of the first deposition, I want to just kind of start with what opinion you expect to give in this case. It gets very lengthy, but she states several opinions that she would give. This includes, as he kind of got older and his behaviors got what they thought were more dangerous or more intense in terms of feeling or in terms of hurting other people or hurting themselves, that they, started thinking that we need to manage these behaviors, and the behaviors are so out of control, how can we manage them? And of course, the way they chose to manage them was probably the worst way anyone ever could. Then she said, what else? And that was on page 12. Page 13, lines 7 through 15, where Dr. Rappa describes sort of at length what her opinion is, and then the state goes specifically. In the second deposition that the state took, I had asked Dr. Rappa whether or not in a clinical setting she makes determinations about whether or not a child is a danger to themselves or others. Ms. Coakley specifically, and that was on the second deposition taken on September 27th of 2023 by the state, page 35, lines 7 through 15. The state also asked Dr. Rappa, this was regarding something different that was said in the CPT interview about whether or not is it appropriate to, as a child is using the restroom, sort of have the door open, as there were allegations of that in the CPT interview. And Dr. Rappa said that where there is a danger, that is something that happens in a clinical setting, and that is on page 19 of the September 27th deposition. It's sort of at the end of page 18 all the way to page 19, ending at line 5. As to the oppositional defiant disorder, that is on the September 20th, 2023 deposition, page 38, line 8. Let me just get there. This is the state's questioning of Dr. Rappa. It starts on page 37. I think on page 38, the relevant line numbers would be starting at line 2. Ms. Coakley says, and there's also several other disorders that can share symptoms or overlap or share features, right? Dr. Rappa says yes. Conduct disorders can. I see you nodding. You just have to say yes. Dr. Rappa responds yes. The state then asks oppositional defiance disorder, and Dr. Rappa says yes. And then she lists several other anxiety disorders, social phobias. She lists several other things. So I think in addition to the depositions in the records that the state was provided has been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder and reactive attachment disorder.
Ms. Murad, in any of those, because what you just read doesn't even get close, in my view, of being an opinion being rendered by this witness as to whether she had, based on her review of the records, reached an opinion as to whether ODD was applicable, or based on her review of the records, she had reached an opinion that the child victim was a danger to himself. Just mentioning ODD or being a threat to someone's self is not the same as an expert providing an opinion as to whether that is in fact her conclusion. Do you have anything that indicates that that was her conclusion that she was drawing, that the child victim in this case was suffering from ODD or was a danger to himself, as to which the parents had to respond?
I don't have anything additional to what I've already cited on the record, Your Honor. However, I will say that the idea that the state was not on notice or able to explore this in their own deposition, just as we were in our deposition of Wade Myers, I think is not fair.
All right, well, whether it's fair or not, I'm not going to comment, but both sides know that trial is not the time for dropping new opinions with an expert witness, and I'm not going to permit it in this instance, so I'm going to stay with my original ruling that the questions concerning this witness's opinion on ODD or that the child victim was a potential threat to himself have not been properly disclosed, and therefore they're not going to be permitted to be introduced in this trial. Ms. Murad, anything else you wish to make for the record before I bring the jurors back out? All right, thank you. Mark, you may go ahead and bring the jurors out. And Ms. Murad, you may continue with your direct. All rise.
Jury in.
All right, everyone may be seated. Thank you. You may continue, Ms. Murad.
Thank you, Your Honor. When we talk about reactive attachment disorder and complex PTSD, are there behaviors associated with those diagnoses that can become harmful or dangerous to people, to the child or the people around them?
Yes.
Are those behaviors exhibited in this case?
Yes.
Take us through how you've come to that opinion.
Okay, so we know that as early as 2015, some of the symptoms that are being documented for the child include things that are emotional lability, like the temper tantrum, sleep issues, anger and frustration, anxiety and fears. This is, kind of how we pinpoint PTSD in a child, and especially in a very young child, because, again, they can't really tell us what's going on. There were also indications in the records where there would be inappropriate behaviors that were hurtful toward other people, and maybe not, maliciously done by the child necessarily when he was young, but so impulsive that, if the thought crossed his mind, he would go ahead and just do whatever it was that he thought about, and it would result in somebody getting injured. There were also, records that suggested that he was doing things that were dangerous in the home, and dangerous to other people that lived in the home. So, and that's not an uncommon thing when you see children with reactive attachment disorder, because those children really do have very active minds, and while they can be very impulsive when they are emotional, they also can be kind of calculated. They can figure out something that they want to do or take apart, or how they can steal something, or how they can pull something over on an adult, and then they're able to do that. So you get kind of both of that with a reactive attachment disorder child in it. And these things make them dangerous to themselves many times without them even realizing it, and dangerous to others.
Is there evidence in the record that prior to 2018, there were issues with roaming around the house at night?
I'm going to object.
Sustained.
Did you rely on records that indicated sort of wandering or eating at night?
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained.
Based on the records that you reviewed, sort of what, do you have any opinions as to why? So you mentioned that his behaviors didn't have predictability. Is that fair to say?
Didn't have what, I'm sorry?
Predictability.
Correct.
Why is that concerning for a parent?
When you have behaviors that aren't predictable, and the child is trying to kind of outsmart you or get one over on you, you're not quite sure what's coming next. So sometimes what's coming next is something that can be pretty dangerous.
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
I move to strike, Your Honor.
Answer, the last part of the answer is stricken. Jury's instructed to disregard it.
Is there evidence in the record, as you just stated, that one was exhibiting dangerous behaviors?
I'm going to object.
Sustained.
I want to talk about a particular, admitted in his trial testimony that you've reviewed in coming to your opinions, correct?
Yes.
That there was a search that he made on his school laptop for something very violent. Are you aware of what the substance of that search was?
Yes.
What was it?
I'm going to object as to hearsay.
Sustained.
What is, can you explain to us how the searches that people make, like why is that relevant in determining anything about someone's, whether or not that person is a danger?
When you're looking at it,
Approach. All right, objection sustained. Ms. Murad, you may continue.
Is it your opinion that the Ferriters were responding to his behavior?
Objection, speculation. Also asked and answered.
I'm going to overrule in part, sustained in part. You can answer it, but it has to be solely with reference to what you observed and reviewed in the records that you reviewed in connection with your opinions as an expert in this matter.
you ask again?
Sure. Is it your opinion that the Ferriters were responding to his behavior?
Yes.
And is that behavior indicative of early childhood trauma?
Yes.
Do we see Ronan's behaviors or the ones that the Ferriters are responding to prior to May of 2018?
Objection.
Sustained.
Did you rely on records in coming to your opinion before 2018?
Yes.
No further questions.
All right, cross, Ms. Coakley.
Morning, Dr. Rappa.
Good morning.
So you were hired by the defense in this case.
Yes.
And you charged them a fee. What was your fee in this case?
I charge $350 an hour. As of today, I have made $5,000.
And then there'll be an additional amount for testimony today.
That is correct.
Preparation for this type of thing, correct?
Yes.
Now, today, your work is mostly in the courts.
Correct. 100%.
Right. And mostly criminal cases, correct?
Not necessarily. I do a lot of civil cases also.
But as a court psychologist or a forensic psychologist, that means that you do things like competency evaluations for the court?
No, ma'am, I don't do very many competency evaluations. I'm not on the wheel or get appointed by the court for that. Occasionally, I might do one for a criminal attorney, but it's very rare.
You do insanity evaluations sometimes?
Yes.
Whether or not someone was sane at the time of the trial?
Yes,
You do risk assessments for sex offenders?
I do.
You do assessments for criminal defendants in general to make a determination for things like sentencing,
Yes,
to
I do.
advise the court. You haven't been involved in any publications related to childhood trauma, attachment disorders, or bizarre punishment, correct?
I have not.
And you don't do peer review for that type of stuff for scholarly journals.
I do not.
And while over the course of your career you have treated patients, you don't treat reactive attachment disorder.
I don't. I treat early childhood trauma. I have no issue with that. But once it gets into persistent reactive attachment disorder, no, I would refer that out.
You would send it to another professional in the field.
I would.
And while you have testified as an expert in court on a lot of different topics, a lot of different psychological issues, you've never testified in court before on a case involving extreme, bizarre, or malicious punishment, correct?
Yes, I believe that's true.
So this is the first one.
Yes.
Now, I want to talk about the items that you reviewed in this case. You did not speak to the defendants, correct?
That's correct.
And so your assertions about what they intended or what they thought or what they were trying to do, that's not based on any direct information that you have, correct?
That's right.
You don't actually know for sure what they were acting on or what their intentions were, correct?
No, I have not spoken to them, so I would not know their intent.
And you didn't actually speak to anyone in the case. You reviewed the records similar to Dr. Myers.
Yes.
And when I say that you reviewed the records, there's records from some prior practitioners. You didn't speak to them either, correct?
I did not.
Now, I want to talk about your opinion. You can't give a diagnosis in this case, correct?
I would feel very uncomfortable giving a diagnosis without interviewing someone.
Okay. And so part of that is that you have insufficient information to make a definitive diagnosis, correct?
Right, because I'm missing that interview portion.
But you do have an opinion on whether or not the defendant's actions were an appropriate way to manage the behaviors in this case, correct?
Yes.
It is your opinion that the way that they chose to manage the behaviors is probably the worst way anyone could ever manage these type of behaviors, correct?
That's correct.
Now, although you can't make a diagnosis, you think that there are indications that the child in this case has complex PTSD as well as an attachment disorder, right?
Yes.
And if a child does have an attachment disorder or complex PTSD, the way the defendant acted towards the victim is the complete opposite of what anyone should have done with a child with one of those conditions, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
In fact, confining and isolating a child can exacerbate those disorders, correct?
That's right.
And so exacerbate means make those symptoms worse.
Yes.
Correct. Even in a child that doesn't have PTSD or an attachment disorder, this type of treatment of any child creates a risk of harm to that child, correct?
I agree.
To both the mental and physical health of a child, correct?
Yes.
So there is a reasonable likelihood that of psychological harm to a child that is treated this way, even if that child does not have any underlying issues.
I agree.
Isolation is not something that is used for children, correct?
It should not be. People
Right.
do, but it should not be.
Right. It's not recommended.
That's correct.
It's not considered acceptable within the psychological, within the child abuse community, really within normal community, correct?
Yes.
Now, I want to talk about some of the records specifically that you reviewed. Reviewed some emails from Immaculate Heart, correct?
I did.
That is where the child in this case went to elementary school, correct?
Yes.
So he's in 4th, 5th grade when he's at Immaculate Heart, correct?
Yes.
And if we do the math, that means he's about 10 and 11 years old during that time frame, correct?
That would be right.
So you reviewed an email from February 13th, 2018, which was one of the things that the parents got notified of, a behavioral problem by their son, correct?
I'm not, without having it in front of me.
Sure,
I'm
I
not
can get
sure,
it if you
yes,
look. But
I
there
did
was,
look at
one
it.
of those emails was about because he was using a bad word, correct?
That's correct.
That's one of the things that they got contacted about, correct?
Yes, he used the F word.
Right, and he said that using bad words makes him feel bigger, that he can be protected from the bigger kids if
Yes.
he uses bad words, correct?
He did.
He's 10 years old at that time, correct?
That's right.
On February 28, 2018, he punched a kid, correct?
Yes.
And that was in response to getting kicked correct? That's the information.
That's what he said, yes.
That was the information provided to the parents, correct? 10 years old still at that time, correct?
Yes.
On May 15, 2018, we had that incident where he pushes another child against the wall with his fingers on the child's throat, correct?
Yes.
And the teacher concluded in that case that both children were not saying nice things to each other in that incident, correct? That kind of proceeded.
That's what she wrote, yes.
Right. And at that point, the child in this case was 10 years old also, right?
Yes.
There's October 29, 2018. That email is about roughhousing during a game. That's how the teacher put it, that he was roughhousing, right?
Yes.
December 3rd, 2018, they also got contacted, and it's because he stole a piece of candy off his teacher's desk.
Yes.
January 29th, 2019, he kicked a ball at a student, correct?
Yes.
And he got punished by the school by sitting out of recess and writing a letter of apology.
Yes.
And February 2019, they also got contact because he stole a container of sprinkles.
Correct.
He's 11 years old when he stole the sprinkles from school.
I would say so, yes.
February 2019,
Yes.
10 or 11. February 2019 is when there was a mutual physical altercation with another student,
Yes.
where they get into a fist fight, the little boys, and they're both punished. They both get detention.
Yes.
And March 8th of 2019, that's when there was the technology issue, and he was found with a calculator, right?
Yes, he had stolen a calculator, correct.
And then March 22nd, 2019, he embarrasses his sister in class, correct?
Yes.
And that's about a month after his brother is born,
Yes.
when we know, based on the timeline, that he's already living in the garage that they built for him in Arizona, correct?
Yes, he would be by then.
A fifth grader, 11 years old.
Correct.
And then March 27, 2019, he uses inappropriate language again. He says another bad word.
Yes.
So between 2018 and 2019, at the elementary school, there's 2 incidents that involve physical contact with another child. The fighting incident and the push against the wall.
Against the wall, yes.
For the large part, every other behavioral incident was something like saying a bad word or stealing a piece of candy or stealing another item.
Yes, that's correct. It's stealing or the candy, and then the humiliation of his sister, which I think was on a whole different level.
He got up in front of the class and he made her cry in class.
I mean, I think that if you look at it that way, it looks, kind of simple. He got up in front of the class and made fun of his sister or said some things, but really,
that's what occurred, right? My question is, that's actually the action that occurred, right? He's in the 5th grade, 11 years old, and he says something mean in front of the class about his sister, correct?
that is what happened.
Okay. Now, I want to talk for a second about that neuropsychological exam that we discussed. And that neuropsychological exam happened in October of 2022.
Yes.
So on the timeline, this occurred after the defendants were arrested and were charged with child abuse, correct?
That's right.
They did not have any of that information about the neuropsychological exam prior, correct? As far as you know.
Yes, correct.
And there's no indication from the records you reviewed that the defendants ever sought a neuropsychological evaluation prior to being arrested for child abuse, correct?
That's right.
And there is background information, I think you talked about it with the defense, that is self-reported, correct?
Yes.
That means that there is information that the child provided, and then there's also information that Ms. Ferriter provided, correct?
Yes.
And because of that, the report includes a limiting instruction or a cautionary instruction, correct?
Yes, all reports would.
And that information was provided after Tracy Ferriter had already been charged and arrested with the abuse of her child, correct? And the report itself contains the caveat that because it in part relies on self-reported information, it is limited in extent, correct?
Yes.
That it's highly subjective,
Yes.
correct? And it may contain errors of interpretation, correct?
Yes.
And also omissions.
Yes, people are giving you their own perspective of the situation.
And you talked about those neuropsychological the results, and there was in part some difficulties in executive function and impulse control Correct, right? That was two of the things that report found, correct?
Yes.
And both of those things can be the result of trauma, correct?
Yes.
And ongoing abuse throughout a child's childhood could make issues with executive functioning worse.
Absolutely.
It also could make, if there's ongoing abuse throughout childhood, it can make issues with impulse control worse, correct?
Yes.
Anytime you take a child who has an early childhood abuse or neglect, and then you add to that, it's going to exacerbate any symptoms that they have, correct?
Yes.
So if you take a child that has early childhood neglect or an adverse childhood experience, right, like in the orphanage, that would be an example of an adverse childhood experience, typically, correct? If you take a child like that and then you subject them to additional ongoing abuse, that might exacerbate their symptoms, correct?
For sure.
Now, the report that we're talking about also talked about that the victim in this case had some difficulties in executive functioning, correct?
Yes.
And the way in which he was treated has the risk of increasing those difficulties, correct?
Yes.
He also had, you called it some difficulties in self-monitoring. The way that he was treated would increase the difficulties in self-monitoring, correct?
Sure.
You also mentioned that it was determined that there's some difficulties with emotional regulation, correct?
Yes.
The way that he was treated would increase his difficulties with emotional regulation, correct?
Yes.
Now, a child that has these characteristics that you said that were clinically significant, it is never an appropriate treatment for those types of clinically significant difficulties, the way he was treated, to confine him.
Yes, you're right.
You also noted that there was some difficulties in impulse control, but confinement is never an appropriate treatment for those difficulties either, is it?
That's correct.
And this report that occurred in 2022, it actually didn't come to the conclusion that he had reactive attachment disorder.
No, I believe he gave him an impulse control disorder.
And these types of difficulties that you talked about, difficulties in impulse control and executive functioning, they're not actually part of the diagnostic criteria for a reactive attachment disorder.
That's right.
Right? Individuals who do not have reactive attachment disorder can get these same results.
Sure. I mean, if they have a disorder of impulse, they can get it just because of that.
And these are areas of the brain that you also see impacted by someone who has PTSD.
Yes.
Now, want to talk about additional thing you reviewed. You said one of the things that you reviewed was the deposition. And I think it noted that the deposition was 5 hours long.
Yes, it was long.
That's a long time for any person, never mind a child, correct?
Yes.
And it's sometimes people, when discussing things, even traumatic things, respond in a way that is not necessarily considered normative or appropriate, correct? Sometimes people laugh inappropriately.
Sure.
Now, I want to talk about reactive attachment disorder more specifically. So, reactive attachment disorder is a diagnosis that's in the diagnostic. Tell me what it's called, the DSM. What does it stand for?
DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
And so that is the manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use that sets out the standard diagnostic criteria for a lot of psychological and psychiatric conditions.
That's true.
Also has some behavior disorders, some personality disorders, lots of different things. But it's a standardized way in which we evaluate if someone meets those criteria, correct?
That's right.
And you couldn't formally make the diagnosis in this case of reactive attachment disorder.
I did not, no.
But your opinion that there is some reactive or there's some attachment disorder characteristics here is based on the review of records of other people, correct?
Yes.
You don't know the methodology that any of the other people who looked at him relied upon, correct?
Yes, I don't know specifically. I know if they're licensed, then they would have to abide by, whatever their professional license is and the DSM to make a diagnosis.
But the reports that we have don't go into the underpinnings of their diagnosis, correct?
No, you wouldn't necessarily get that from anyone exactly how they got to their diagnosis, but you would assume if they're licensed that they have taken tests and been educated and supervised and know how to diagnose appropriately.
One of those people that made a diagnosis is a Mr. Kenny Miller, correct?
That's correct.
He is actually a licensed clinical social worker, correct?
Yes, he is.
So that's a master's level practitioner, right?
Yes, he is.
Not someone who has a doctorate like yourself or Dr. Myers.
Correct, but I will say that some of the best clinicians I've ever met in my life are licensed clinical social workers. So just because they have a master's degree as opposed to a doctorate doesn't necessarily make them a lesser clinician.
You actually, though, don't have any of Mr. Miller's clinical notes, correct?
I do not. Only what I was given, which I believe was a letter talking about when he had talked to the Ferriters and when he had seen them.
Okay, so you don't have any of the treatment progress notes that were contemporaneous to when he was treating in this case, correct?
Yes, I do not.
The only thing you have is a letter that he wrote after the defendants were arrested, correct?
Yes.
And the letter doesn't explain the diagnostic criteria, correct?
Not at all.
It doesn't indicate if he even met with the child. It's kind of vague as to whether or not he did.
I think he said he met with the child.
Right, but it's unclear once, twice, beyond that.
Right, that was hard to determine how many times he had met with the child, how many times he'd met with the parents. But he did say they had ongoing communication.
And if he did in fact meet with them, the time frame that we're talking about is after the child, the victim in this case, was 10 years old, correct?
That would be right.
And you're familiar with the DSM and the criteria that they have for reactive attachment disorder, correct?
Yes.
That manual also provides some cautionary instructions that practitioners should take into consideration when reaching a diagnosis, correct?
That's true.
And some of those cautionary instructions as it applies to reactive attachment disorder is that it shouldn't be diagnosed after the age of 5, or if it's done, it should be done with extreme caution.
I agree
Correct?
with that.
That's what the DSM says.
Yes.
And based on the very limited information we have from Mr. Miller, we don't know why he is making that diagnosis after 5 years old, correct?
Right, I'm not sure why. I'm assuming that he would make a diagnosis the way anybody that is licensed would make a diagnosis.
And then you also review the records of a Dr. Reichenbacher.
Yes.
If I'm saying that correctly. And Mr. Reichenbacher is a psychiatrist.
Correct.
And he, you have some of his treatment notes from his meetings with the family and the child, correct?
Yes,
He notes reactive attachment disorder and ADHD, correct?
he does.
But he has no indication of the appropriateness of whether or not why he's making that diagnosis after 5 years old, correct?
Right, I don't think that you would normally see in somebody's treatment summary how they arrived at that diagnosis. You would see the diagnosis that they rendered, and you would assume that it was because they had records available or interview available, however they made the diagnosis. But we would assume if somebody is licensed that they're giving a diagnosis based on their professionalism and their knowledge.
And so you're making some assumptions about what they're relying upon because we don't have any additional information, correct?
Right, but there are standards and rules of how we diagnose somebody. So it would be very rare indeed for somebody to be diagnosing out of the blue with no information whatsoever.
Now, in looking at Dr. Reichenbacher's notes, there's no indication of whether or not in making his diagnosis that he was aware that during this time frame, the victim is being confined in a structure that his parents built in the garage, correct?
Right, that is not in his notes.
There's no indication that he was aware of that, correct?
Correct.
And that would be important information for a psychiatrist to have in making a differential diagnosis.
I think so. I would have liked to have that information.
Now, Dr. Reichenbacher saw between December 2018 and January 2019, correct?
Yes.
And so the last time we have of him being involved in all was January of 2019, correct?
Yes.
Which is 2 years prior to the arrest in this case?
Yes.
Now, there's a handful of meetings, 3-4 meetings total, correct?
That's right.
And the meetings, aside from the initial assessment, are about 20 minutes long.
Yes.
And the victim in this case is 11 years old at the time.
Yes.
And so in December 2018, they have their initial evaluation, correct?
Yes.
And the recommendation is that perhaps the victim in this case may need behavioral therapy.
Correct.
And then in May 7th of 2019 is the next meeting,
Yes.
correct? And it's noted from the report that the parents reported to their psychiatrist that they were seeing for the behavioral problems of their child that he is not having severe aggressive behavior at school. That's what the parents report, correct?
Yes.
And they also noted adequate behavior at school regarding focus and hyperactive behavior, correct?
Yes, he had been placed on medication at that time.
And then the doctor decided at that point that the treatment going forward would be to continue medication and therapy, correct?
Yes.
But there was a problem because the parents were going to go away for the summer, so he might not be able to get that therapy.
I don't remember why they didn't, but they didn't get the therapy at that time.
Now, in January 23rd, 2019, they also went back to Dr. Reichenberger, correct?
Yes.
And the chief complaint that his parents brought was that he has some anger, correct?
Yes.
And the mom reported some improvements in his ability to not get angry or apologize and later on, correct?
Yes.
And the child got tearful when his mom was talking about him, correct?
That's what the report said, yes.
And they reported that he had not been seeing a therapist at that point. And the doctor, again, recommended that they should do medication and meet with a therapist, correct?
Correct.
At no point did Dr. Reichenbacher recommend confinement
Never.
to the parents. And at no point did the parents report that there was issues with the child hurting animals, correct?
To that doctor?
To Dr. Reichenbacher.
Right, to that
No.
doctor, no.
And I think that you mentioned that that was something that may have existed in this case, but isn't it true that the only issue that he ever had with an animal is when he overfed a dog?
No, he had been riding a bicycle and was riding the bicycle into the dog.
Okay, so he hit the dog with a bicycle.
Yes.
And you know that in 2022, in January, at the time that we're talking about from reviewing the videos, that there were times where the child is allowed to be alone with the dog?
No, I didn't.
You didn't see that? There's times
I did see him out with the dog, but he wasn't, the family was around.
Okay. Did you see any of the videos where he's alone with one of the dogs in the room, in his structure in the garage, locked in the room, and the dog's in there?
Oh, I didn't recall that.
No. Okay. And there's other times that family had multiple pets where he's allowed to be around with the pets?
Yes,
Correct?
I mean, I definitely saw him with the family with the pets.
Now, going back to reactive attachment disorder, social and the diagnostic criteria, social neglect is a necessary condition, meaning that there has to be a time in the early childhood where their child was subject to extreme neglect, correct?
That's right.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that just because that occurred that a child is going to have reactive attachment disorder, correct?
That's right.
And when a person has reactive attachment disorder, there's actually two types, correct?
Yes, it's been divided into two types.
There's one where the child is overly affectionate, almost indiscriminate with their affections towards adults.
Yes.
That does not seem to be the case here. There's no indication of that.
No.
So that's not what we're talking about here.
Correct.
The other one is when the child has difficulty forming attachment, correct?
Yes.
And there's nothing in the criteria or what we're looking at in diagnosing it that has anything to do with violence.
No, it's only if the child will refuse to be comforted by a caretaker or will not go to the caretaker to be comforted. So it's very specific.
Okay, so you saw a lot of times see a child that appears withdrawn or unable to be comforted by an adult.
They're not necessarily withdrawn, but they're unable to be comforted. So they're having intense temper outbursts, and the parent goes to comfort them, and they don't want that. It makes it worse, actually. Or the child hurts himself or is out of control emotionally and won't go to that parent for soothing. So it's a very disturbed way of attaching.
Right, but there's nothing in the criteria that says that the child has to react towards themselves or others in a way that involves violence.
No, I mean, not necessarily. But when you look at it and when you look at reactive attachment disorder as it is studied, these are the behaviors that are seen in the studies when people are diagnosed with this.
Now, when people are diagnosed, the DSM tells us to, and I think you've already agreed, that after 5, it should be done with extreme caution. And that's in part because it is unclear if reactive attachment disorder even occurs after the age of 5, correct?
Sure. So what happens is many people, some people are in the camp that, you know, you can have persistent reactive attachment disorder that goes through middle childhood, through adolescence, into adulthood. Some people are of the camp that, hey, it's reactive attachment disorder, but really what's underlying it is that complex PTSD, and that's why we see it continue throughout the lifespan. So it really just depends on what camp you're in. There's a little bit of research for both.
Now, according to the DSM, the reactive attachment disorder is incredibly rare, correct?
Yes, it's not something that you would see often in your practice.
And you're familiar, and it's something that is considered that has a high risk of misdiagnoses, correct?
I think that it did back in the day when people were first hearing about it and calling everything that a child did rad, you know, everything was rad. I think now clinicians are way more cautious about diagnosing, but when you see somebody like Ronan that has that really severe neglect, malnutrition, scabies, I don't think that it's a leap. I think it's you know, it makes sense and based on his behavior.
Well, you're a member of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, correct?
I am a member, yes.
And that is, it goes by the acronym ABSAC.
That's right.
And as a member, you stay up to date on the professional recommendations and also ABSAC's positions on the latest research and community standards for the treatment and for child abuse, correct?
Correct.
And ABSAC, the task force, issued a report on attachment disorders and attachment problems, correct?
They did.
And the report points out that that reactive attachment disorder is actually incredibly rare, correct?
I agree with that.
And they also point out it's also known that there is an inappropriately high number of children misdiagnosed with those, especially those who have only a mild or moderate symptoms, correct?
Yes.
And the report points out that, and I think you already discussed, that there is incredibly abusive ways in which sometimes reactive attachment disorder gets treated.
Yes.
That includes extreme control over every action that the child has, correct? In extreme circumstances.
Yes, it's parents that are desperate parents trying to control these behaviors, and they're controlling these behaviors in ways that are detrimental to the child.
That are harmful.
Yes.
And the report points out that one of the key things for treating reactive attachment disorder, or ways in which it is recommended in general to be treated, is it focuses on actually the actions of the parent as opposed to the child.
That's correct.
The most effective therapies actually don't rely upon the child, correct?
It's mostly teaching the parent how to parent that type of child, because parents think, especially foster parents or adoptive parents, think that love is enough. And if they just lavish this child with love, this child's going to get better. And it's very frustrating for that parent when they're trying to do all they can and the child is not changing or getting worse.
Now, I want to talk about hoarding food. Hoarding, stealing food is something that you see commonly in children that have a history of deprivation or come from deprived or neglected backgrounds, correct?
That's right.
And the way in which to deal with that behavior is not to limit access to the food.
It depends. Now, there actually are many foster parents that put locks on their refrigerator because during the night the kids will get up and they'll eat every single thing. So I think that there is a way to therapeutically put some limits, but to take food away from child or not let them have food, that's totally inappropriate.
Now, let's talk about PTSD. You said that it's your opinion that there is complex PTSD here that occurred in the early childhood, correct?
Yes.
The DSM also sets criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, correct?
It does.
And it has a separate criteria for children that are over 6 and children that are under 6, correct?
Yes.
And the first thing in order to be diagnosed with PTSD is you have to directly experience a traumatic event, correct?
That's right.
And it gives examples of traumatic events, but there are things like actual threat of physical violence, death, bodily harm, correct?
Sure.
It doesn't talk about lack of food or being in an orphanage. There has to be an actual physical violence experienced by the child, correct?
No, I totally disagree with that. I don't think that the DSM-5 could list all the different types of trauma. And I think severe neglect absolutely would be part of severe trauma for children. Also, you say bodily injury. Starving a child and giving them sugar water is bodily injury. So yes, these children are experiencing trauma and they're experiencing bodily injury. They're just not old enough to talk about it.
So the DSM says exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. Directly experiencing the traumatic events, right?
Correct?
Witnessing in person the events as it occurred to others, especially primary caregivers, correct? Or learning that the traumatic events occurred to a parent or caregiver, correct? Those are the three things that they have to directly experience, correct?
It could be either one of those.
It could be any of those three, and the alternative.
He had directly experienced it.
Now, you also said that it can occur in infanthood, but the DSM says that PTSD can occur beginning only after the first year of life, correct?
You would wait till they were like 9 months old before you would diagnose that. But again, it would be diagnosed not through the DSM if they are a young child. It would be diagnosed through the diagnostic classification 0 through 3, which is a whole different book.
Okay. But the DSM, right, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, says that it's occurring after the first year of life, correct?
Right.
For PTSD.
I mean, that's what they say. And you're not going to necessarily diagnose PTSD until a child is a little bit older, because you would have to see emotional lability. You would have to see that child having difficulty sleeping. There'd have to be some symptoms that you're seeing that wouldn't be attributable to that child just being a newborn.
So in complex PTSD, you see interpersonal trauma, and these traumas have caused them to experience fear, horror, anxiety, to the point where they now have developed a disorder, correct? That's how you would describe it.
Yes.
And symptoms that you may see in a child that has, or a person that has PTSD, are emotional reactivity, correct? Emotional numbing, correct?
Yes.
Lack of trust.
Yes.
And avoidance, correct?
Correct.
And there are treatments for PTSD even for young children.
There are.
And there is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, correct?
You can start that as early as age 3.
Some people do EMDR with children.
Yes.
And the focus is not on the behaviors when treating PTSD, but what's underlying those behaviors in terms of abuse and neglect, correct?
Exactly.
It would not be appropriate to confine a child to a room with PTSD as was done in this case, correct?
Correct.
That would never be appropriate, correct?
Correct.
Reacting to a child who has complex PTSD or an attachment disorder with things like anger and threats is not productive or helpful to a child with those conditions, correct?
Right.
And those reactions create a psychological harm to the child, correct?
Yes, and it can exacerbate problems that were already there, for sure.
Adding to the existing harm.
Yes.
Making it worse. I see you nodding. We just have to say
Yes.
out loud, yes. So PTSD can be worsened by ongoing abuse and neglect, correct?
Yes.
In fact, you would agree that there would have been damage done to the victim's neuropsychological health from the defendant's actions in this case, correct?
Yes, most likely.
It's your opinion that the way that his parents handled the symptoms from PTSD exacerbated it, correct?
I do believe that.
And this is not a way that a child with early childhood neglect should be parented, correct?
That's right.
Not only was it harmful, but none of the ways in which they addressed him or he was treated would be useful as constructive punishment, correct?
Right. No.
Now, I think that you also said when we spoke previously that there were some indicators that the child was experiencing some symptoms of depression prior to the removal from his parents.
Sustained. Next question.
Let's talk about abuse and neglect generally. Over the course of your career, have you come across cases where there was ongoing abuse and neglect, but the abuse and neglect wasn't apparent to others who interacted with the family?
Say that last part again, I'm sorry.
Have you come across cases of abuse and neglect, ongoing abuse and neglect, where that ongoing abuse and neglect wasn't apparent to people that interacted with the family?
Oh, wasn't apparent? Yes.
Sustain. You
Your Honor,
want to approach? You can.
Involving abuse and neglect, can the child who is exposed to ongoing abuse grow a tolerance for the environment that they're in?
Overruled.
Yes.
And so even in cases where that environment that they're subjected to is abusive or neglectful.
Sure, yes.
So there can be a normalization of that type of treatment for the child.
Yes.
Now, I want to talk for a second. Just make sure I didn't miss anything. About the interventions that occurred. You talked a little bit about that. Defendant provided you with an attempt or a list of their attempted interventions, correct?
They did.
Based on the information available to you, the last time that the victim in this case was seen by a psychiatrist or a mental health professional to address any behavioral issues was mid-2019, correct?
That is true, although I did, after that, after our deposition, I did receive information that they had reached out to I believe, a medical doctor, a primary care physician, and were asking for referrals for a psychiatrist, but they were in the process of getting the referral from their doctor before he could go to see one.
Right,
And that was more recent.
So the last time, though, that he was ever seen, as far as you're aware, by a psychiatrist or a psychologist was in mid-2019.
Yes.
And recently there might have been maybe we should talk to someone again, correct?
Yes, that's when they moved here.
Right, after they had already been confining their child for approximately 3 years, correct?
Yes.
They also provided you that they sent one email in December of 2022, or December of 2021, excuse me, that they reached out about a meeting with a transcendental meditation person.
Correct. They were trying to get into transcendental meditation to help
Right.
calm his behaviors.
They sent one email in December of 2021, correct? Based on
Correct.
the information that you had.
Correct.
Transcendental meditation is not a medical doctor, a psychiatrist,
No.
a psychologist, a licensed clinical social worker.
I'm not sure who can do it, but I don't believe it is in the mental health field.
And based on the information provided to you, there were no counselors after that date either. He wasn't continuing to see a therapist or a mental health counselor or a licensed clinical social worker after mid-2019, correct?
Correct.
And based on the information provided to you, that he started being held in the structure in early 2019, correct?
Yes.
And there also was no indication that an individualized education plan was ever sought at his school.
Right. I believe he was in private schools, no? But
So-
no, they did not.
Yeah, so there was no individual education plan. And then when he came to Independence Middle in Jupiter, when they moved in December of 2021, January of 2022, there was no IEP sought, correct?
Right. I don't think that, I mean, they had just gotten there, and I believe it was over Christmas time. So I don't know that they would have been getting it that quickly. But no, I didn't see evidence of it being sought.
Did you see that they reported no behavioral problems when they enrolled him in to Independence Middle School in Jupiter?
I don't recall that, but I'll take your word for it.
Now, I want to talk about the impacts this type of treatment would have on a child. I think you've already said that it would exacerbate any pre-existing problems that the child may have, correct?
What would, I'm sorry.
The type of treatment, the way that he was kept and confined, correct?
Oh, yes.
Would it also, and isn't it true that it's your opinion that it will also make the child feel rejected, correct?
Yes, it could.
It make the child feel like they're not good enough, correct?
Yes, it could.
It make the child feel like they are inherently bad, correct?
Yes, it could.
It can lead the child to maneuver or manipulate through a situation to avoid that isolation.
Yes, it could.
It can lead to depression, correct?
Yes.
it can lead to suicidal ideation, correct?
It could.
When a punishment is chronic, meaning that it happens on an ongoing basis, you will see a bigger impact too, correct?
For sure.
And as to the victim in this case specifically, you think that what was going on with him, the issues that he was having prior, was really exacerbated by how his parents acted towards them, correct?
Yes, that's my belief.
There is a psychological impact, a negative one, when punishment is humiliating and isolating, correct?
Yes.
Now, as to the appropriateness of the punishment, it's your opinion that you don't think anything that they did or attempted to do that they did would help him be better, correct?
Sustained.
Isn't it true that it is not appropriate to punish bad behavior by placing a child in a situation where they don't have access to an ordinary bathroom?
Yes.
It's your opinion that should never have been done in this case, correct?
Yes.
That type of treatment is also humiliating, correct?
Yes.
The same is true for locking him from the outside. That is something that should never have been done, correct?
I agree.
That's also true for the inability to control the lights. That is inappropriate, correct? Inappropriate. That is going to have a negative impact on a child if it happens over a longer period of time, correct?
Yes.
Having a child sit in the dark in a locked room for long periods of time is not an acceptable form of punishment.
Sustained.
It is the type of thing that would cause harm, correct? That wasn't.
Sustained.
At no point is there any indication that these parents were advised to engage in this type of behavior, correct?
I didn't see any professional telling them to do that.
And that's because it would be something that would not be recommended by someone within the mainstream psychological and psychiatric community.
Yes, I'm glad you said mainstream, because absolutely there are many professionals that believe in a very militaristic type of parenting, authoritative type of parenting, strip everything out but their mattress, take their door off the hinges. There are professionals and paraprofessionals that do believe this is a way to parent, but people that are mainstream and that really know the research would never have suggested that.
Right. And there's no indication that even these non-mainstream people are involved here and said that you should do this, correct?
Right. I would not know that. Right.
The only advice that we know about is medication and therapy, correct?
That's correct.
That's all the questions I have.
All right, redirect, Ms. Murad.
Dr. Rappa, the state spent some time in their cross-examination sort of challenging the diagnosis of attachment disorder. So I want to talk about that, okay?
Okay.
Is your opinion solely based on the diagnoses that previous providers have made?
No.
What else is it based on?
I mean, that does help to know that previous providers had seen the same thing. But it has to be on behaviors and it has to be on early childhood experiences, especially as it pertains to children, you know, from birth to age 3.
And in the record, did you see those patterns of behavior that led you to come to your opinion about the attachment disorder?
I did. I saw the severe neglect. I saw the scabies. I saw the malnourishment. And then I saw the behaviors. Or not saw, I saw in the records. The behaviors.
And you reviewed Wade Myers' trial testimony. Did the state's own expert, in fact, testify that likely has reactive attachment disorder from early childhood neglect in his own testimony to this jury?
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay, argumentative.
Sustained.
In reviewing Wade Myers' testimony, is it consistent with your opinion on attachment disorder?
Yes.
The state asked you about the deposition that you saw and his sort of affect and behaviors. And the state mentioned that, you know, it's long, he's a kid. Is that what you made of it, or his affect, that it was just because he was a kid and it was a long deposition, or were there actual things about his affect that were concerning to you in coming to your opinion?
There were things in his affect that were concerning to me that went on my radar as I was watching.
Could you take us through those?
Sustained. You want to approach on that, Ms. Murad? Because I think she testified to that in her direct.
I think she did as well, Judge. That's fine.
Sustained.
And so you
Objection
maintain the
sustained.
same, sorry, you maintain the same opinion you had in direct examination, correct?
Yes.
The state mentioned, it sounds a little silly in retrospect, but something like transcendental meditation. Did the Ferriters sort of try both medical and non-medical options over time?
Objection, hearsay.
Overruled. You can answer.
Yes, they did. They tried many different things. They tried putting him into like karate, and they tried chess club, and then they tried to burn his energy off with track. They did
Let me
try.
stop you. Are you testifying from your review of the documents that you reviewed as part of your opinion? Or are you testifying from conversations with somebody?
No, sir, I didn't have conversations.
So, all right, so I'm going to allow the answer. You can continue.
Thank you. Go ahead.
They also tried putting him into a meditation class so that he could learn to control his behavior. So I think they tried, and they tried nutrition, they tried taking away gluten, they tried taking away sugar. I mean, there was a bunch of different things that they did try that were outside of the mental health world.
Based on your experience sort of working with families and particularly children with a history of trauma and their parents, I mean, is that, I guess, what do you make of that? Was that neglectful of them and not pursuing every medical option? Or is it something that parents do in trying to?
Objection, improper opinion.
Sustained.
The state mentioned the transcendental meditation, and you mentioned several other efforts that the Ferriters made. Those are obviously not medical efforts, correct?
Correct.
Does that change your opinion as to whether or not they engaged in malicious punishment?
No, does not change my opinion.
Why not?
I think that they were trying the best that they knew, and what they.
Sustained.
Without what you think, so the state's expert testified that based on the Ferriters' conduct, he believed that there was malicious punishment, correct?
Objection, leading.
Finish the question. You hadn't finished. I hadn't gotten to the. You hadn't gotten to the question. So finish your question.
Is there conduct that you have reviewed that shows to the contrary?
Yes.
Okay. And can you take us through how you've come to that opinion?
Yes. There's conduct by Tim that the tone is terrible. The tone is awful. And how he's talking to the child with that tone is bad. But what he is saying to the child isn't horrible. He's saying, I want you to get better. I want you to make right choices.
Sustained.
Your Honor, there's already in evidence. The jury watched the Ring videos.
Response? I remember one of the videos where that was said. So as to that particular comment, I'm going to allow it. You can continue your answer, ma'am. Objection overruled.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Rappa.
He was saying, I want better for you. People are going to not want to be your friend or be close to you if you continue to act this way. I want things different for you. And while his tone was bad, what was coming out of his mouth was not bad if he had been using a different tone.
The state talked about let me start with this. The state talked about the effect that the Ferriters' actions had. You're not disputing that what they did was wrong, right?
No.
Okay. So let's sort of take it back to that 2018 period. The state mentioned a number of different school emails or referrals that had sort of acts that had between 2018 and 2019. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
In cross-examination. They talked about stealing sprinkles, some fights that happened. Is that correct?
Yes.
First off, how does a psychologist separate what is regular childhood behavior from what is so concerning that it amounts to a disorder?
I think that what we look at is persistence. Is this happening over and over and over? Is it a pattern of behavior? And is this behavior not going away, even though school might be punishing or the parents might be punishing or giving consequences? The behavior continues to persist.
Do you see that as it relates to in the records in this case?
Yes.
Do you see that in this case, in the records as it relates to even prior to May of 2018 when Tracy got pregnant?
I'm going to overrule it because it's already been, the answer's already been made of record, so it's really cumulative at this point.
You can answer this question, and then I'll move on, Judge.
So yes.
Okay. The state mentioned that in your work, this is the first case that you've testified regarding malicious or allegations of bizarre punishment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Have you testified about early childhood trauma?
Yes.
How often?
Oh, my word.
Hundreds of thousands.
A high number. I mean, I've been doing this for 20-something years, and, you know, I do trauma work, so a high number.
And when you are sort of hired, do you work for both the defense and the state?
I do.
If you had to put a percentage on it, how often are you working for the defense versus the state?
Right now, probably about 50-50.
And is that locally in South Florida and nationally?
It's throughout Florida.
And have you in fact been hired by this state attorney's office on a number of cases as it relates to childhood trauma?
Childhood trauma, I don't remember in specific childhood trauma, but I have been hired and enjoy working with them.
One moment, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Murad. All right, ma'am, you just remain where you are. Ladies and gentlemen, it's about 12:20. We're going to go ahead and break for lunch for you folks. We'll start back at 1:30, so be outside at the elevators at 1:25 to meet with Mark, and he'll bring you to the jury room. Remember, you haven't heard it for 3 days, but I'll remind you, don't discuss the case with each other or with anyone else, do any kind of research at this point. Other than that, enjoy your lunch. All right, everyone may be seated. Let me have counsel approach you. Ma'am, can you come down here in front of the bench, please? Okay, so you guys can go back to your table. Before I let the attorneys go for lunch, go to the mic. Yeah. So the question I have is for the afternoon session, you have about 3 hours of.
My hope is to play the videos that I intend to play. I provided the state with a actual copy of the video, and just so the court knows, I understand the state's entitled to time to review it. I'm not, we'll deal with any objections. These are the videos that were in the 21,000, so these are not.
Okay.
These were in the state's possession.
Well, the 21,000 is already in evidence, right? I mean,
No.
What is in evidence? I thought it was.
The room. The state admitted videos only of inside the room, and then
But then we had a subset of that as well that was played, right?
Correct. So what was played is room. I would have a problem with my ability with what they're entering in. On Sunday, they provided me a list of 3,000 videos. It's 50 hours.
But what's your legal objection? Because
So
if.
I've already looked through some of them. Some of them are self-serving hearsay. They're saying things to the child.
Okay, guys, I guess that's it. I will see you tomorrow. I have no idea where she gets that music. I like it though. So I will see you guys tomorrow. She's gonna stream closing arguments tomorrow. So I will be in chat with y'all. Thank you. I will see you later. And if